I have always believed that silence tells stories more powerful than sound. Stadiums echo with chants, whistles, and the thunder of collisions. But history often lives in the moments when the noise fades and only absence remains. The National Football League has always thrived on spectacle. Yet beneath its growth and glamour, there are chapters marked not by trophies or records, but by silence. By names that disappeared from rosters and never returned. When the Second World War engulfed the globe, the NFL entered one of those chapters. The league was still fragile, still fighting to justify its existence in the American sporting landscape. And then, war demanded something that no playbook could prepare for. It demanded the bodies of its players, the sacrifice of its future, and the forfeiture of men who had once been known only as athletes, but who became soldiers and, in too many cases, casualties. In the early 1940s, professional football was not the empire it is today. College football still commanded the prestige of Saturday afternoons. Baseball still carried the title of America's pastime, and the NFL struggled for legitimacy. Teams often played in small stadiums. Players supplemented their modest salaries by working second jobs in factories, warehouses, or classrooms. The league was not yet a cultural giant, but a working-class pursuit, a gritty enterprise held together by men who played less for fame than for the chance to test themselves. When war arrived, it shook every corner of American life, and the NFL, still trying to establish itself, had no immunity. I think of those opening days after Pearl Harbor. December 1941 shattered illusions of distance. Suddenly, the conflict overseas was no longer someone else's burden. Within weeks, young men across the nation found themselves staring at draft notices. Among them were professional football players, many just beginning their careers, some already known as stars. Their choices were not really choices at all. Duty called, and the game could wait. For some, it would never resume. Take Al Blozis. At 6'6" and over 250 pounds, he was one of the most physically imposing men to ever wear a Giants uniform. His teammates remembered his wingspan, his easy strength, and his quiet but commanding presence. He was an all-pro, still in the early years of what promised to be a dominant career. Yet, when the Army came calling, Blozis did not hesitate. He went overseas, leading patrols through the unforgiving terrain of the Vosges Mountains in France. In January 1945, he was killed in action while searching for two missing men under his command. His body lay in foreign soil, his name recorded briefly in newspapers, then slowly fading from the collective memory of the sport he had once defined with his size. Or consider Jack Lummis. He too had worn a Giants uniform, playing as an end. On the field, he was known for toughness and persistence, never the flashiest but always relentless. In the Marines, he carried those same qualities into battle. On Iwo Jima in 1945, he led his unit under relentless fire, continuing to push forward even after being gravely wounded by landmines. Refusing evacuation, he urged his men onward until his body could no longer sustain him. He died on that island, posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his courage. In the halls of the NFL, his name is seldom mentioned, yet his sacrifice belongs to the deepest truths of the league's history. These men were not alone. Dozens of players left the comfort of stadiums for the terror of battlefields. Some returned altered forever, carrying injuries that ended their careers or memories that shadowed them for the rest of their lives. Others never returned at all. They do not appear in record books because their numbers never had the chance to grow. They are not honored in Hall of Fame speeches because their careers ended on beaches and in forests far from home. They are the forgotten casualties of the NFL, the men whose sacrifice exists at the margins of history. The league itself nearly collapsed under the weight of absence. Rosters thinned as stars enlisted or were drafted. Coaches scrambled to fill uniforms with men from smaller colleges or even local factories. Teams merged to survive. The Steelers and Eagles became the Steagles in 1943, a desperate attempt to field enough bodies to keep the schedule alive. For fans in the stands, the product looked different. The polish of familiar stars was gone, replaced by patchwork rosters and unfamiliar names. But the games continued, if only as a reminder that life at home still carried on while sons and brothers fought overseas. The contrast was stark. A Sunday afternoon might feature a hard-fought game in Philadelphia or New York, while Monday morning's headlines listed casualties from North Africa, Italy, or the Pacific. The proximity of those worlds created an uneasy balance. Fans cheered touchdowns, knowing that the men who scored them a season earlier might now be facing bullets on another continent. For the players, the transition from gridiron to battlefield was disorienting. The discipline and toughness honed in football helped them in uniform, but war was not a game. There were no crowds to celebrate their bravery, only comrades who prayed they would live to see another dawn. What haunts me most is not the fact that players died. War touches every profession. What haunts me is how their stories disappeared into the shadows. We celebrate the mythology of football, the legends of Lombardy, the dynasties of the modern Super Bowl era. We recite statistics and records with the reverence of Scripture. But the names of men like Blosies and Lummis are left behind, faint footnotes in a history written by survivors. Their sacrifices are not woven into the fabric of the game's official story. Their absence is rarely acknowledged in the highlight reels that define the league's narrative. The war years demanded a toll that cannot be measured in standings or championships. They asked for flesh and blood, for futures never lived, for seasons never played. The NFL's survival through those years was remarkable, but survival came at a price. Every roster that limped forward through the early 1940s did so with the weight of missing men. Every touchdown carried the shadow of players who once could have scored, but were now carrying rifles instead of footballs. It is tempting to remember the war years through the lens of resilience, to frame the NFL as a symbol of endurance and normalcy on the home front. There is truth in that. The games gave fans something familiar, a sense of continuity in a world turned upside down. Yet that truth is incomplete. The fuller story demands that we confront the lives cut short, the men who never returned, and the way their absence shaped the league as profoundly as any victory on the field. I imagine what it must have felt like for fans reading the sports pages beside the war reports. One column described a hard-fought win, another listed casualties. In those moments, the line between sport and survival blurred. Football was still played, but the stakes of life had shifted. The NFL was no longer just a league trying to prove itself. It was an institution forced to grapple with loss, with the reality that its players were part of a generation consumed by war. This story is about those men, their sacrifices, and the silence that followed. It is about peeling back the surface of the NFL's early decades to expose a hidden foundation of service and loss. It is about remembering that the league's survival was purchased not only through perseverance at home, but through the ultimate sacrifices made abroad. The casualty lists may have faded, but their impact remains. To understand the NFL's history, to see it clearly, we must return to those years when football was a fragile echo beneath the thunder of war. We must acknowledge the players whose names were erased not by retirement or injury, but by the demands of history itself. Their stories matter because they remind us that the league was never separate from the world around it. It was shaped by it, scarred by it, and in many ways defined by the men it lost. The silence they left behind still lingers. Now it is time to break it. The story of the National Football League is often told as a tale of grit, growth, and glory. We celebrate the leather helmet legends, the men who built the game from dust and sweat, the pioneers who played through pain so that the sport could take root in American soil. Yet, hidden beneath the familiar nostalgia is a far deeper story, one that reshaped the league, not just through the collisions on muddy fields, but through the battlefields of a global war. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States was thrust into the Second World War. And the NFL, still a young and fragile institution, faced a test unlike any other. Players traded shoulder pads for uniforms, playbooks for rifles, stadium crowds for the deafening silence of foxholes. The men who had once been Sunday heroes became soldiers, sailors, and airmen. Some would return, scarred but alive. Others never came back at all. And the league, in its quiet way, carried those losses like invisible wounds. This is not the story of championships or box scores. It is the story of the NFL's forgotten war casualties, men whose names once echoed in newspaper headlines, but now live faintly in the margins of history. Men who balanced two callings, one to a struggling sport that still fought for national attention, and another to a country at war. Their sacrifices became an unspoken foundation of the league we know today. To understand the magnitude of what happened, we need to place ourselves in the world of the early 1940s. The NFL was still a niche enterprise, operating in the shadow of baseball and college football. Teams were small, stadiums modest, and rosters often stitched together with part-time players who worked second jobs in the off-season just to survive. Yet even within that fragility, a fraternity was forming. Players like Sid Luckman, Sammy Baugh, and Don Hutson were shaping what professional football could become. Then came Pearl Harbor. December 7, 1941. The day that altered everything. In the weeks and months that followed, American life was reordered, and football was no exception. Newspapers were filled with lists of athletes volunteering for service. College stars postponed careers to enlist. NFL players, many still in their 20s, chose duty over glory, knowing full well that they might never again see the gridiron. The league scrambled to adjust. Rosters thinned to dangerous levels. Teams merged just to survive, with names like the Steagles, a wartime combination of the Pittsburgh Steelers and Philadelphia Eagles, becoming symbols of desperation. Schedules shifted, attendance fluctuated, and the question lingered. Should professional football even continue during war? Some argued it was frivolous, even disrespectful, to play games while young men were dying overseas. Others insisted it was a necessary morale booster, a reminder of normalcy in a world turned upside down. President Franklin D. Roosevelt himself, in his famous Green Light letter, encouraged sports to go on, believing they could lift spirits on the home front. But behind the public debate lay private tragedies. Dozens of NFL players were called into action. Their names may not ring familiar today, but each represented a life interrupted, a story redirected. Some, like Chicago Bears tackle Joe Rout, would never return. Rout had been an All-American at Texas A&M, a star lineman with a future as bright as any in the league. Instead, he became a captain in the U.S. Army and was killed in action during the Battle of the Bulge in 1944. His death barely registered in sports sections back home, buried beneath casualty reports that numbered in the thousands. Others endured the war but were forever changed. Buffalo Bison's lineman Jack Lummis, for example, earned the Medal of Honor for his bravery on Iwo Jima, where he led a charge before being mortally wounded. His name is etched in military history, but in football lore, it is nearly absent. These men straddled two legacies, but over time, only one was remembered. As the war dragged on, the NFL teetered on the brink. The Cleveland Rams suspended operations entirely in 1943. The Steelers rotated players so frequently that coaches joked they barely knew their own rosters. By 1944, some teams fielded squads made up largely of men classified as 4 EFOs deemed unfit for service due to health conditions. The quality of play suffered, but the league survived, clinging to relevance during a national crisis. The survival of the NFL through those years is often attributed to luck and resilience. Yet survival came with a cost: the silent sacrifice of its players in uniform, whose stories were quickly overshadowed by the league's post-war boom. When the war ended in 1945, America's attention shifted to prosperity and growth. Football, now poised to capture a new national audience, leaned into the spectacle of sport. But the memory of its war dead was not enshrined in Canton, not highlighted in highlight reels, not given the same reverence as championships or records. This documentary is an attempt to restore that memory, to ask hard questions about what was lost. What does it mean that the NFL owes part of its survival to men who never returned? How does a league reconcile glory with grief, entertainment with sacrifice? And why, decades later, are these stories still so seldom told? We will trace the journeys of players who left the field for the front, examine how the war reshaped the league's identity, and confront the silence that followed. We will revisit forgotten names like Joe Rout, Jack Lummis, and Al Blozes, the New York Giants tackle who fell in the Vosges Mountains while leading his men against German forces. We will connect their sacrifices to the fragile survival of the NFL during its most precarious years. This is more than history. It is a reckoning with how we choose to remember. Because every Sunday, when millions watch the modern NFL, the echoes of these men still linger. They are part of the game's foundation, though rarely acknowledged. Their absence is as telling as their presence once was. The league that emerged from World War II was different, stronger, yes, in some ways, more visible, more American. But it was also built upon unspoken loss. The post-war boom in attendance, the rise of televised games, the golden age of Starzall were made possible because the league endured its wartime trial. And endurance came with names and faces that faded into obscurity, even as the NFL grew into a national powerhouse. That is the paradox of this story. Football survived, but in doing so, it forgot. It became easier to celebrate the spectacle of victory than to linger on the cost of sacrifice. It's easier to build the mythology of toughness without admitting that toughness, for some, ended not in championships, but in graves far from home. In the chapters to come, we will step into that silence. We will walk alongside the young men who left behind stadium cheers for the uncertainty of war. We will revisit the games played with patchwork rosters and merged franchises. We will hear the voices of journalists who questioned whether football even had the right to exist in wartime. And we will remember those who never returned, whose absence is itself a testament to how much the game asked of them. This is not nostalgia. This is not celebration. This is memory, raw and necessary. Because if the NFL is to truly honor its past, it can not only remember the touchdowns and trophies, it must also remember the losses, the sacrifices, the players who gave not just their bodies to the game, but their lives to their country. As I reflect on this forgotten chapter, I think of how easily stories slip away. How the roar of the modern NFL, with its billion-dollar stadiums and global reach, can drown out the quiet sacrifices of a different era. This documentary is an act of resistance against that forgetting. It is an attempt to place war and football side by side, to see the cost clearly, and to restore the voices of those who were silenced too soon. The league we know today was shaped not only by what happened on the field, but by what happened far away from it. In Europe, in the Pacific, in deserts and forests, and seas where young men who once played football fought their last battles. Their stories matter. Their sacrifices demand recognition. And their absence still shapes the game, even if we rarely acknowledge it. That is where our journey begins. Not with a celebration of victory, but with a reckoning of loss. Not with the myths of football's rise, but with the forgotten truths buried in the shadow of war. When the United States entered World War II, the NFL was not the behemoth we recognize today. It was fragile, overshadowed, and constantly fighting for legitimacy. Yet even in its uncertain youth, the league was bound to the same national call that swept across every household. The war would touch every city, every family, every profession. Football players were no exception. The story begins with a single name that reveals the tension between gridiron glory and battlefield duty. Al Blozes, standing 6'6" and weighing nearly 250 pounds, Blozes was an imposing tackle for the New York Giants. He was one of the most dominant linemen of his era, a man who seemed built for both football and the myths that surrounded it. In 1942, as war raged overseas, Blazes was drafted not by a team, but by the United States Army. Because of his size, military regulations initially restricted him from combat roles. He spent months in training stateside, restless, unsatisfied, longing to join his teammates, not on the field, but in the fight. Blazes pressed his commanders relentlessly, demanding reassignment. He wanted the front lines. He wanted the risk. Eventually, he was transferred to Europe and assigned to the 28th Infantry Division. There, stripped of celebrity, he became just another soldier. His final days came in January of 1945, in the freezing forests of the Vosges Mountains. Blazes disappeared while searching for 2 missing men from his platoon. He was never seen alive again. His body was later recovered, lifeless, in the snow. Back in America, the New York Giants and their fans mourned. But the news came, like so many others, casualty among thousands. Newspapers gave Blazes a headline, but within weeks the story faded, drowned in the scale of war. His football career was over in an instant, but more tragically, his life was erased before it could unfold fully. Al Blazes was 26 years old. His story illustrates the fragility of professional athletes in wartime. These were not untouchable figures insulated by fame. They were young men, many barely into adulthood, suddenly caught in the sweep of history's most devastating conflict. And for every Blazes, there were others whose lives followed similar arcs of promise cut short. Take Joe Rout, a star guard from Texas A&M who played briefly with the Chicago Bears. Rout was an All-American, a man celebrated not only for his athletic skill, but for his leadership. When war came, he joined the Army and rose quickly through the ranks. By December 1944, he was a captain fighting in the Battle of the Bulge, one of the war's bloodiest engagements. He was killed in action just days before Christmas. Back home, the Bears carried on. The league carried on, but Rout's absence was permanent. Another promising career erased. Another player remembered only in scattered tributes. Jack Lummis offers yet another example. An end for the New York Giants. He played alongside Blazes in the early 1940s. Lummis was known for his tenacity, a man who refused to quit no matter the odds. In 1942, he enlisted in the Marine Corps and found himself on Iwo Jima in 1945. Leading an assault on enemy positions, Lummis was hit by mortar fire but pressed forward despite devastating injuries. He eventually succumbed to his wounds, but his bravery earned him the Medal of Honor. In the annals of American military history, his name is preserved. In NFL history, his story is barely remembered. These men were not alone. Nearly 1,000 NFL players, coaches, and personnel served during the Second World War. Some returned as heroes, others never came home. The league, already thin on resources, carried the burden of these absences, but it also benefited from the symbolic weight of their service. The NFL could present itself as part of the national fabric, sacrificing alongside the rest of the country. Yet the individuals who paid that price were often reduced to footnotes, their lives subordinated to the league's survival. The toll of the war was not measured only in deaths. Many players returned alive, but changed. Physical injuries cut short careers. Psychological scars lingered long after the war ended. A generation of athletes learned that the pain of the gridiron, no matter how severe, was incomparable to the horrors of combat. The toughness of football became a metaphor, but for those who had fought, the metaphor was inadequate, even hollow. The NFL itself teetered on the edge during these years. With rosters depleted, some franchises barely fielded teams. The Steagles, a temporary merger of the Pittsburgh Steelers and Philadelphia Eagles in 1943, became the most famous example of wartime improvisation. The team combined players, coaches, and resources simply to survive a season. Fans laughed at the awkward name, but the reality was stark. Without such measures, the league might have collapsed entirely. Other teams were not so fortunate. The Cleveland Rams suspended operations in 1943 due to lack of manpower. Attendance at games dwindled, and journalists openly questioned whether professional football should exist at all during wartime. Yet the league persisted, buoyed in part by President Roosevelt's belief that sports could serve as morale for the home front. That belief kept football alive, but it did not erase the sacrifices of the men who were no longer there to play. The war revealed the dual identity of professional athletes. On one hand, they were entertainers, symbols of strength and resilience for fans desperate for distraction. On the other, they were citizens, subject to the same draft notices and wartime realities as everyone else. For many players, there was no choice between the two. Football had to be set aside, sometimes permanently. What remains striking decades later is how little these sacrifices are remembered in the narrative of the NFL's rise. The league often celebrates its milestones, the first championship game, the emergence of television, the rise of dynasties, but it rarely pauses to acknowledge how close it came to losing everything in the 1940s, or how many of its players lost far more. The names of Blosies, Rout, and Lummis should stand alongside the legends of Hudson, Luckman, and Baugh. Instead, they are ghosts, faint reminders of a time when the game and the world collided in devastating ways. As I reflect on these stories, I see more than individual tragedies. I see the outlines of a pattern, a reminder that the NFL's endurance during World War II was built on human cost. Without these men, the league might not have survived those years of crisis. With them gone, it carried their absence silently, folding their memory into the background while focusing on the future. That silence is part of the story. It is as important as the survival itself. This first glimpse into the wartime NFL reveals a league both vulnerable and resilient. Vulnerable in its manpower, its finances, its relevance. Resilient in its determination to persist, even when logic suggested it should fold. But resilience has a price. And in the case of the NFL during World War II, that price was measured not just in empty rosters, but in lives cut short, careers abandoned, futures erased. To tell the story of the NFL's forgotten war casualties is to wrestle with that contradiction. The league survived, but its survival came with silence. The players who gave their lives are not part of the Hall of Fame highlight reels. They are not household names celebrated in documentaries or anniversary specials. They exist in old newspaper clippings, in military records, in the memories of families long since gone. And yet, without them, the story of football in America cannot be complete. Their absence is itself a presence, a reminder that the game we watch today rests on a foundation of sacrifice that stretches far beyond the field. To remember them is not to diminish football's growth, but to ground it in truth. The NFL's rise to power was not only about touchdowns and television deals. It was also about endurance in the face of loss, about men who left the field behind and never came back. Their names may be fewer today in the public imagination, but their legacy is vast. It lives in the fact that the NFL endured. It lives in the fact that the sport could carry on even in wartime. And it lives in the silence that lingers when their names are not spoken, a silence this documentary seeks to break. The story of Al Blosies, Joe Rout, and Jack Lummis is just the beginning. Their sacrifices symbolize a much broader reality, a generation of players torn between two callings, forced to make choices that would define not only their lives but the fate of the league itself. Their stories compel us to look deeper, to question what it means to remember, and to acknowledge that football's history is as much about what was lost as what was won. This is the heart of the NFL's forgotten war casualties. It is where memory begins to replace myth, where sacrifice replaces spectacle, and where we begin to see the game not only for what it became, but for what it nearly lost. If Al Blosies, Joe Rout, and Jack Lummis represent the ultimate price paid, then the broader wartime NFL shows us what survival looked like when survival itself seemed unlikely. By 1942, as more and more players left for service, the league's foundation began to crack. Rosters that had once been full of sturdy veterans and young prospects now looked like patchwork quilts, stitched together with whoever was left behind. What unfolded was one of the strangest, most precarious periods in football history, when the line between legitimacy and collapse blurred every Sunday. It is impossible to grasp the tension of those years without looking at the Steagles. The very name sounds like parody today. But in 1943, it was a desperate measure to keep professional football alive. The Philadelphia Eagles and the Pittsburgh Steelers were both decimated by the draft. Neither team had enough men to field a competitive roster. So, under league orders, they merged into a single hybrid franchise. Players wore the Eagles, Kelly green, and the Steelers, black and gold. Coaches from both organizations bickered constantly over strategy. The roster was a mix of misfits, older men classified as 4F due to health issues, a few young talents not yet called into service. And yet, against all odds, the Steagles managed to produce a winning record. They finished 5-1, a modest mark, but a miracle considering the circumstances. Fans in both cities had mixed feelings. Some resented the loss of identity. Others recognized the strange team as a symbol of perseverance. Newspapers covered them with equal parts mockery and admiration. But the Steagles were more than a novelty. They were proof that the NFL could bend without breaking. The following year, the Steelers merged again, this time with the Chicago Cardinals, forming the Card Pit. Unlike the Steagles, this team was a disaster. They went 0-10, were outscored by nearly 300 points, and became known derisively as the Carpets, because everyone walked over them. Players were often unfit, training regimens inconsistent, and morale non-existent. Yet even this fiasco revealed something essential. The NFL was willing to endure embarrassment if it meant survival. Folding teams was not an option. The league had to hold the line until the war ended. Beyond mergers, the quality of play across the league suffered. Fans who attended games often found themselves watching rosters filled with men who, under normal circumstances, would never have made it to the professional level. Aging veterans past their prime returned simply because they were too old to be drafted. College stars sometimes played a handful of games before being whisked away to military training. It was football in flux, improvised week by week. And yet, those games still mattered. For the men in uniform overseas, box scores and headlines offered brief reminders of home. Letters from soldiers often mentioned scores, players, or rivalries, showing that even in the midst of war, football tethered them to normalcy. For fans stateside, attending games provided a few hours of distraction from rationing, casualty lists, and constant uncertainty. The league's survival, fragile as it was, gave the nation something familiar to hold on to. Still, beneath the veneer of entertainment, the moral question lingered. Was it right to keep playing football while young men died in Europe and the Pacific? Some sports writers argued it was selfish, that players who remained behind should be ashamed. Others pointed out that many of those who played were classified for F, men who physically could not serve, and that it was unfair to condemn them for contributing in the way they could. Roosevelt's Greenlight Letter, written in 1942, ultimately silenced much of the debate. In it, the president argued that sports should continue because they boosted national morale. He knew that war demanded sacrifice, but he also knew that a country needed outlets. Symbols of resilience and reminders of normal life. Football became one of those outlets. The paradox of wartime football is that it was simultaneously diminished and elevated. On the field, the product was weaker, the rosters thinner, the spectacle smaller. But symbolically, the league's persistence carried weight. The very act of showing up, week after week, even with merged rosters and struggling teams, represented a kind of quiet defiance. The NFL was saying, America will not stop. Life will not stop. This game will not stop. For players, however, the contradictions cut deeper. Men who played through the war often faced jeers for not serving, even if their health disqualified them. Others lived with the guilt of being on a football field, while their teammates were in foxholes. Many carried the uncertainty of knowing they could be called up at any moment. The locker room was no longer just about preparing for Sunday. It was about wondering how long Sunday football would even last. The league office, led by Commissioner Elmer Layden, walked a delicate line. Layden himself had been one of Notre Dame's famed Four Horsemen, a figure steeped in football tradition. Now he had to steer a professional league through unprecedented crisis. His policies emphasized survival above all else. Teams could merge, rosters could shrink, standards could drop. But the league must continue. In hindsight, his stubbornness kept the NFL alive, though critics at the time often accused him of clinging to something trivial during a moment of global catastrophe. What is easy to forget is how fragile the NFL truly was. Baseball was America's game, commanding vast audiences and cultural weight. College football had deep roots, powerful traditions, and loyal fans. The NFL was the underdog of American sport. Without continuity through the war, it might have dissolved into irrelevance, overtaken permanently by its competitors. The decision to play on, to endure the Steagles, the card pit, the makeshift rosters was not just about morale, was about survival in a marketplace where the NFL had not yet secured its future. The war years became a crucible. They tested not only the durability of the game itself, but the commitment of those who loved it. Fans who stuck with the league through the awkward wartime seasons carried their loyalty into the post-war boom. The resilience of franchises like the Bears, Giants, and Packers gave them a foundation for dominance in later decades. And the memory of players who went off to war became part of the league's quiet, unspoken history, even if their names rarely made it into official narratives. But for every success story of survival, there was a reminder of fragility. In 1944, the Brooklyn Tigers went 0-10, their franchise barely hanging on. After the season, they were effectively absorbed by the Boston Yanks. It was a sign of how close the league remained to collapse, without mergers, without improvisation. Without the symbolic support of the government, the NFL might not have lived to see the post-war era at all. Looking back, I see the wartime NFL as a reflection of the country itself. Strained, uncertain, improvising constantly, yet unwilling to break. Games were sloppy, attendance was low, and the talent was depleted. But the persistence of football in those years gave Americans a sense of continuity. It reminded them that even in times of profound loss, something familiar could endure. Oh God. The forgotten war casualties of the NFL are not only the men who died overseas, they're also the men who never had a chance to play, whose careers were swallowed by circumstance. They are the franchises that disappeared, the games that barely held together, the stories of players who returned but never regained their pre-war form. Their absence is as much a casualty as the lives lost in combat. When we remember the war, we often remember the victories, the battles won, the triumph of the Allied forces. When we remember football, we remember dynasties, championships, and stars. But woven into both legacies is a thread of survival that is quieter, harder to see, but just as vital. The NFL survived World War II not by thriving, but by refusing to quit. It survived because of the players who stayed, the fans who cared, and the sacrifices of those who left and never came back. This is the paradox I keep returning to. A league weakened on the surface, but strengthened beneath it, scarred by loss, yet hardened for the future. And as the war years stretched on, that paradox only deepened. For soon, the stories of those lost players would be joined by stories of those who returned alive, bearing scars that would shape not only their lives, but the identity of professional football itself. The war had an unrelenting way of stripping away illusions. In the locker rooms of the National Football League during the early 1940s, the sound of laces being tied and pads being buckled carried a heavier echo than in decades past. These were not only men preparing for a Sunday contest. They were men standing in the narrowing space between two callings, the game they loved and the war that was consuming the world. It is one thing to play through pain, broken bones, or concussions, conditions familiar to every player of the era. It is another to play knowing that any season could be your last, not because of age or injury, but because of orders from Washington. The draft boards were relentless, and the league could not shield its athletes from the call. By the end of 1943, more than 600 NFL personnel, players, coaches, trainers, would trade uniforms of leather and wool for fatigues and steel helmets. Take the story of Al Blozis, the towering tackle of the New York Giants. At 6'6", 250 pounds, he was a giant among giants. An athlete so gifted that sports writers of the day believed he could redefine the position. His size, his agility, his ability to dominate the line of scrimmage made him a cornerstone of New York's defense. But when the war came, Blozis could not rest in the role of a protected star. He was restless, convinced that he had a duty larger than the gridiron. Blozis lobbied for combat duty, even as his athletic reputation would have allowed him to remain stateside. Training recruits or playing exhibition games meant to boost morale. His pleas were eventually granted. He was deployed to Europe, where in early 1945, near the Vosges Mountains of France, he entered battle. His unit was cut off in the snowy forests. Blozis went searching for missing men under relentless fire. He never returned. The league lost not just a player, but a man who symbolized the tension between athletic fame and patriotic sacrifice. His death was reported in newspapers with the same gravity as a fallen general. The story of Al Blozis became a haunting reminder that the NFL was not immune from the toll of war. Blozis' story was not isolated. Don Wemple of the Brooklyn Dodgers, a fullback with rugged determination, answered the call of duty as well. He had once been described as having a nose for punishment, a player who carried the ball into walls of defenders without hesitation. Wemple, too, would not survive the war. His name joined the quiet, devastating list of professional athletes who never came back. The war casualties of the NFL did not only include the dead. There were those who returned forever changed. Men like Tony Canadeo of the Green Bay Packers, who served in the Army before resuming his Hall of Fame career, carried within them the shadows of battle. Some spoke sparingly of what they saw. Others never mentioned it at all. The silence of returning veterans was its own kind of wound. Consider the psychological weight. Men who once played before crowds of 30,000 in stadiums of smoke and autumn air now found themselves crawling through mud under fire, unsure if dawn would arrive with survival or annihilation. The collision of bodies on a football field could no longer compare to the collision of artillery and infantry. For many, football became both a refuge and a reminder. The roar of fans could momentarily erase the echoes of war, but it could never fully silence them. The league itself teetered under the strain. Rosters were gutted, teams forced to merge simply to survive. The Pittsburgh Steelers and Philadelphia Eagles combined for one season in 1943, creating the awkwardly named Steagles. It was a desperate measure born from necessity, a sign that the NFL was willing to bend reality to keep the game alive during wartime. Some teams brought in older players, semi-professionals, or men classified as unfit for military service. The quality of play was uneven, but the act of playing, of keeping football alive, became its own form of defiance. Yet behind the survival of the league stood the absence of men whose names should have filled the record books. Imagine the statistics never recorded, the careers cut short, the legacies forever reduced to a line in wartime obituaries. Al Blozis could have been one of the most dominant tackles of his generation. Don Wemple could have become a household name in Brooklyn. Their erasure is not only a human tragedy, but a distortion of football history. The fans of the time understood this. Newspapers ran columns that blended box scores with casualty lists. A touchdown on Sunday could be followed by a headline on Monday that the same player had shipped out to the Pacific. War blurred the boundaries of entertainment and mortality. Football was never simply escapism in those years. It was a mirror reflecting the fragility of life in a world engulfed by violence. I often think about how the young men of that era carried themselves. They had been raised in the Depression, accustomed to scarcity, conditioned to believe that sacrifice was expected, not optional. Football, in many ways, had prepared them for the war. The discipline, the pain, the loyalty to a team greater than oneself. But war took that preparation and pushed it into the abyss of human suffering. The NFL's forgotten war casualties are not merely footnotes in history. They are reminders of what was lost when the league went to war. Each name represents a life, a family, a set of ambitions never realized. And each story forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth. The game we celebrate today was shaped not only by victories and championships, but also by the blood of men who traded the gridiron for the battlefield. There is a haunting dignity in their sacrifice. It lingers in the silence between plays, in the gaps of record books, in the faint recognition that the sport could have been different if fate had allowed these men to return. Their absence is part of the NFL's DNA, invisible but indelible. As we move deeper into this story, the question becomes unavoidable. What did it mean for the NFL to continue when so many of its players were gone? Was survival itself a form of victory, or was it a compromise with loss? The answer lies in the resilience of the league, the adaptations it made, and the unspoken cost it carried into the post-war years. Because as the war dragged on, the NFL would face not only the absence of its fallen, but the transformation of those who returned. The league that emerged from World War II would not be the same as the one that entered it. And the memory of its casualties, forgotten by many, but etched in the conscience of those who lived it, would remain an invisible shadow over the game. This was not just about football. It was about how a young league, still fighting for relevance, intersected with the greatest conflict of the 20th century. And in that intersection, lives were lost, legacies altered, and the meaning of the sport was forever changed. When we talk about survival, we often measure it by bodies returned, by games played, by championships secured. But survival during World War II meant something entirely different for the National Football League. It meant holding the line while its very foundation was stripped away, when nearly every factor seemed aligned against its continued existence. The NFL in the early 1940s was not the cultural powerhouse we know today. Baseball still held the title of America's national pastime. And college football commanded a deeper loyalty from millions of fans across the country. The professional game was, in many eyes, a sideshow. Gritty, interesting, but still fighting for relevance. The war threatened to undo decades of fragile progress. It forced the league to confront a reality that few wanted to admit. The NFL could disappear altogether, swept aside by a world consumed by global conflict. To understand the precariousness of the NFL in those years, you have to picture America in 1943. Rationing shaped everyday life. Gasoline was limited, rubber was scarce, and steel was redirected almost entirely to the war effort. Entire industries had been transformed to serve the needs of battle. Travel for football teams became a logistical nightmare. Trains were crowded with soldiers and supplies, so franchises resorted to long, grueling bus rides that tested both endurance and morale. Equipment was stretched to its limits. Old cleats were patched instead of replaced. Jerseys were reused until the fabric thinned. Nothing about the game resembled luxury. And then came the draft boards. Every able-bodied man was subject to service, and no professional status exempted them. By 1943, the exodus of players had reached a breaking point. Some teams lost nearly two-thirds of their rosters. Star players like Sid Luckman, Tony Canadeo, and Bill Dudley left for active duty. Coaches and staff were drawn in as well. The league was hollowed out to the point where it seemed absurd to think that Sunday games could continue. Yet they did, with patchwork rosters cobbled together from what little remained. The desperation led to one of the strangest experiments in professional sports history: team mergers. The most famous of these was the 1943 union of the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Philadelphia Eagles, a wartime hybrid known as the Steagles. The merger was a marriage of necessity, born from rosters too thin to survive alone. Two franchises with bitter rivalries suddenly had to share playbooks, coaching staffs, and locker rooms. Players wore mismatched gear, and practices were a collision of cultures. Against the odds, the Steagles performed respectably, finishing with a winning record and offering fans something they desperately needed: continuity. But if the Steagles were a symbol of resilience, not all mergers fared so well. The 1944 combination of the Chicago Cardinals and Pittsburgh Steelers, nicknamed Card Pit, was a disaster. Winless throughout the season, they became the butt of league-wide jokes. Fans derisively called them the Carpets because every opponent walked over them. Yet even that humiliation spoke to the strange determination of the NFL. It was better to be mocked and survive than to vanish altogether. Behind those mergers was a league clinging to life. Owners knew that shutting down could mean permanent irrelevance. Football's place in American culture was still fragile, and once lost, it might never return. Continuing play, however awkward, was both a gamble and a statement of defiance. The NFL would not go quietly. Still, the quality of play often betrayed the strain. Games were sloppy. Fumbles piled up. Missed tackles and blown assignments were common. Players past their athletic prime returned to fill gaps. While semi-professionals and men medically classified as 4F, unfit for service, suddenly found themselves starting on Sundays. Yet fans came anyway. Stadiums were not always full, but those who attended brought an intensity that reflected the times. Cheering for football was not simply about sport. It was an act of holding on to normalcy, of preserving a piece of civilian life amid the chaos of war. What is remarkable about this era is how it reshaped the NFL's identity. In the absence of its biggest stars, the league turned into a stage for overlooked figures who otherwise might have been forgotten. Journeymen, second stringers, and men who had languished in obscurity suddenly became central to their teams. Ed Michaels, a journeyman lineman who had drifted between teams, became a cornerstone of wartime play. Others like him carried the burden of keeping the league alive. They lacked fame, but they preserved the continuity of the game. Their stories remind us that survival is not always built on greatness. Sometimes it rests on the shoulders of the overlooked. Yet survival came with a haunting cost. For every touchdown scored in an American stadium, there was the risk of a telegram arriving with the worst news imaginable. The league could not separate itself from the war. Newspapers printed box scores side by side with casualty reports. Fans celebrated wins even as they braced for the names of fallen players. The war stripped away the illusion that football existed in its own world. It was intertwined with the global struggle, and every game carried the unspoken reminder of men who might never return. The deaths of players like Al Blozes and Don Wemple cast long shadows. Blozes, the towering tackle of the New York Giants, symbolized everything the league hoped to become. Dominant, larger than life, impossible to ignore. His loss in France was not just personal tragedy, it was a symbolic wound to the entire NFL. Don Wemple, remembered as a fearless fullback, also never returned. Their sacrifices turned stadium cheers into something more solemn, more layered with meaning. Every snap, every play, carried echoes of absence. The NFL leaned into its patriotic duty. Teams organized war bond drives. Games were preceded by military ceremonies, and players who remained stateside often appeared in uniform for promotional campaigns. Football became part of the cultural fabric of the war effort. It was marketed as more than entertainment. It was morale, a connection between soldiers abroad and civilians at home. And yet, beneath the ceremonies, the contradiction remained sharp. How could one reconcile the lighthearted joy of touchdowns with the devastating weight of battlefields? Critics argued that the league trivialized sacrifice by continuing play. Supporters countered that by enduring, the NFL honored those sacrifices. This debate defined the league's wartime years. But when the dust settled, one fact stood clear. The NFL had endured. Through improvisation, sacrifice, and no small amount of luck, it had emerged battered but intact. By 1945, with victory approaching, the NFL could look ahead. Its survival during the war would prove to be more than just endurance. It was the foundation for transformation, because the war had done something unexpected. It had legitimized professional football. The league had shown it could withstand pressure greater than anything it had faced before. In surviving, the NFL positioned itself not as a fragile experiment, but as a permanent institution. That resilience would fuel its post-war explosion. When stars returned, crowds swelled, and football began its march toward dominance. Yet the triumph of survival cannot obscure the cost. The wartime NFL was haunted by absences. It carried scars invisible to fans, but permanent to those who lived it. The next chapter is about those scars, the returning veterans who brought back more than just their athletic ability. They brought with them silence, trauma, and memories of war that would shape the very character of the game in the years to come. When the United States formally entered World War II after Pearl Harbor, the National Football League was not insulated from the call to arms. Players who had once been household names on Sunday afternoons suddenly found themselves anonymous in khaki and olive drab, scattered across Europe, Africa, and the Pacific. It was not merely a symbolic gesture. It was an exodus that gutted rosters, shook franchises, and blurred the line between athlete and soldier. By 1943, nearly every team had lost its stars to the war effort. Some teams collapsed entirely under the weight of military enlistments. The Chicago Cardinals, short on manpower, had to merge temporarily with the Pittsburgh Steelers, creating the awkwardly named Card Pit. A team so depleted that sports writers mocked them as the Carpets, because everyone walked over them. This was the reality of wartime football. The NFL didn't just send men to fight. It became a microcosm of American sacrifice. Between 600 and 1,000 men with NFL contracts or experience would serve during the conflict. That is an astonishing percentage when you consider how small the league was at the time. Whole draft classes disappeared into uniform. Season ticket holders opened their game programs and saw the names of their favorite backs and tackles followed by little asterisks indicating currently serving in the armed forces. Each one of those asterisks told a story that stretched far beyond the stadium. Some were stationed close to home, patrolling coastlines or working logistics. Others were sent halfway around the world, where the familiar roar of the crowd was replaced by the whistle of mortar. Clark Hinkle, the hard-nosed fullback from the Green Bay Packers, swapped his pads for the uniform of the Coast Guard. Sid Luckman, Chicago's great quarterback, balanced his service in the Merchant Marine with his role as a morale figure for war bond rallies. Then there were men like Al Blozes, a mountainous tackle for the New York Giants, who found himself not in a training camp but trudging through the freezing forests of the Vosges Mountains in France. Blozes' story became legend and tragedy. Standing 6'6", weighing nearly 250 pounds, he was drafted into the Army, despite pleas that his size made him too valuable to the league and too vulnerable to the battlefield. Yet Blozes refused any special treatment. He trained as an officer, led men into combat, and in January 1945, while searching for 2 missing soldiers in his unit, he was cut down by enemy fire. He was only 26 years old. The New York Giants would never replace him. Not really. His jersey number was retired, his name carved into the granite of both NFL and military memory. In a way, Blozes became the symbol of the NFL's wartime sacrifice. Proof that these athletes were not playing soldier, but living and dying like every other young American. The war did not discriminate between stars and journeymen. The Pittsburgh Steelers lost Ralph Haywood, a promising end to military duty. The Cleveland Rams watched as their roster thinned, with men like Mike Scarry heading overseas. The Philadelphia Eagles, too, were stripped of talent. their backfield was almost entirely depleted. Even coaching staffs were hit. Greasy Neal, the Eagles' coach, had to work with revolving doors of players who sometimes met each other for the first time in warm-ups before a game. The war changed the way football operated, forcing a league built on continuity to embrace chaos. But beyond the box scores and makeshift lineups was a more human truth. NFL players who went overseas carried with them not just the weight of their rifles, but the memory of the sport they loved. Letters home spoke of longing for autumn afternoons, for the feel of leather laces in their hands. Some men tried to recreate the game wherever they could, fashioning footballs out of rags, playing impromptu scrimmages in mud-soaked fields behind the lines. In a strange way, football followed them to war, becoming both a reminder of what they had left behind and a promise of what they hoped to return to. One haunting example comes from Jack Lummis, an end for the New York Giants who enlisted in the Marine Corps. At Iwo Jima, Lummis displayed the same reckless courage that had made him a fan favorite in the polo grounds. He led his platoon through heavy fire, was gravely wounded by landmines, yet refused evacuation, insisting his men keep pressing forward. He died from his injuries, posthumously receiving the Medal of Honor. Giants fans would later recall how Lummis had played every down with abandon, as though he had no regard for his own body. On that island, thousands of miles from the cheers of New York, he lived and died in that same spirit. The casualty lists mounted. More than 20 NFL men never came home. Their absence was not abstract. They were real names attached to real teams. Every lost player meant an empty locker, a broken circle of teammates, and a hole in the heart of a community. Sports writers of the era often penned somber columns, reminding readers that football was entertainment, but war was life and death. George Halas, the Chicago Bears patriarch, served in the Navy and later admitted that no championship, not even his dynastic runs with the Bears, compared in gravity to watching young men leave for war, some never to return. At the same time, those who did come home rarely returned unchanged. The battlefield left scars, both visible and invisible. Men who had once sprinted down sidelines now limped, their knees shattered not by tackles, but by shrapnel. Others carried mental burdens that the medical language of the 1940s could barely define. Post-traumatic stress was called shell shock or combat fatigue, but its symptoms lingered long after the war. Some veterans tried to resume their careers, while others faded quietly into civilian life, unable to bridge the gap between who they had been before the war and who they had become after it. And yet, the league endured. This is perhaps the most astonishing fact. The NFL, fragile in its early decades, did not collapse under the weight of World War II. While college programs were shuttered, and while Major League Baseball leaned heavily on propaganda and even brought in women's leagues to fill the void, professional football survived by sheer willpower. Teams merged, rosters shrank, and quality of play dipped. But the league lived. And it lived because the men overseas never forgot the game, and the men at home worked desperately to keep it alive for them. Newspapers often carried stories of how servicemen would huddle around radios on far-off bases, listening to scratchy broadcasts of NFL games. For a few hours, as snow fell in Green Bay or crowds roared in Detroit, the war receded. Those broadcasts became lifelines, connecting soldiers to the rhythms of home. Football was no longer just sport. It was culture, morale, a thread-tying battlefield to bleacher. By 1945, as victory drew near, the NFL prepared for the return of its warriors. Teams looked forward to welcoming back men who had grown from rookies into hardened veterans of a different kind of campaign. There was joy in those reunions, but also grief, for not every face returned. Locker rooms would forever echo with the names of Lummis, Blosies, and so many others whose cleats would never again cut through turf. The sacrifices of those players remain, to this day, a little-told chapter in the NFL's story. The league owes its survival not just to ticket sales and strategy, but to the men who answered the call of duty when football was no longer the most important battle in their lives. Because before the NFL became America's dominant cultural spectacle, it was something more fragile, more human. It was a collection of young men chasing glory on Sunday. And when the world demanded, trading that glory for something far greater. And that's where the story sharpens. The NFL would survive the war, but it would never be the same. Its heroes were not just measured in touchdowns anymore, but in medals, in sacrifice, in silence. As the war ended and players began to trickle back home, the league faced its next great question. How do you rebuild a sport when so many of its stars never returned? And how do you honor the memory of those who gave everything? When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, America exhaled with relief. Cities lit up in victory celebrations. Sailors kissed strangers in Times Square, and families embraced loved ones stepping off crowded trains. For the National Football League, victory meant something more complicated. The return of hundreds of players who had traded gridirons for battlefields. But woven into that return was grief, because not every man was coming home. The NFL entered the post-war years with two parallel missions. First, it had to rebuild its teams, reconstituting rosters ravaged by years of military service. Second, it had to decide how to honor the memory of those who had died, the men who had once been teammates, opponents, and heroes in stadiums now standing as silent witnesses to absence. It was a period of resurrection and remembrance, one that would shape the very identity of professional football in America. Players trickled back slowly in late 1945 and into 1946. They came home with duffel bags slung over shoulders, medals pinned to uniforms, and scars hidden beneath stoic smiles. Some were eager to return to the game as if nothing had changed. Others hesitated, unsure if the roar of the crowd could ever replace the thunder of artillery. Yet teams opened their doors, understanding that the sport could serve as a bridge back to civilian life. The Chicago Bears, perennial powerhouses before the war, welcomed back stars like Sid Luckman, who had balanced his merchant marine service with brief appearances in uniform. The Green Bay Packers reclaimed Clark Hinkle, though age and combat had left him a step slower. The New York Giants tried to reorganize their line without Al Blozis and Jack Lummis, two players who had given their lives overseas. Their absence was not just tactical, it was spiritual. Teammates remembered their lockers, their jokes in practice, their presence on the field. Now, those spaces remained empty, a painful reminder that victory came at a cost. Across the league, coaches faced the strange task of reintegration. Men who had fought in North Africa or stormed beaches in the Pacific were asked to slip back into playbooks and practice drills. For some, football was salvation. It gave them a purpose beyond survival, a structure that felt familiar after the chaos of combat. For others, the adjustment was brutal. Bodies once honed for sprinting and tackling were now broken by shrapnel or stiffened by years without conditioning. Veterans returned with knee injuries, hearing loss, and psychological wounds that sports medicine of the 1940s barely recognized. Still, the game went on, and in going on, it became a stage for commemoration. Before kickoff, stadiums held moments of silence for fallen players. Programs listed names of the dead alongside rosters of the living. Fans stood with hats removed, many of them having buried sons, brothers, or neighbors, who never returned from Europe or the Pacific. The NFL's mourning was part of the nation's mourning, a public acknowledgement that the line between sport and war had been tragically thin. Some teams honored specific heroes. The New York Giants retired the numbers of Al Blozis and Jack Lummis, ensuring their legacies would never fade into mere statistics. Stories of their courage. Blozis searching for missing men in the Vosges. Lummis leading Marines on Iwo Jima became folklore passed down through generations of Giants fans. The league itself began to realize that these sacrifices gave it a moral weight, a gravitas beyond entertainment. Football had proven itself as part of the American story, not apart from it. Yet not all memories were treated equally. The NFL of the 1940s did not have the elaborate memorial machinery we see today. There were no league-wide ceremonies televised to millions, no engraved monuments standing at the 50-yard line. In some cases, fallen players were quietly forgotten, their service acknowledged only in dusty newspaper clippings. Teams without stable ownership or enduring fan bases sometimes moved on too quickly, treating war losses as unfortunate footnotes rather than central chapters. This uneven remembrance revealed the league's still fragile place in American culture. It was significant enough to mourn, but not yet sacred enough to guarantee universal honor. As the 1946 season unfolded, the league faced another challenge: how to recapture the public's imagination. During the war, baseball had held the spotlight, its continuity preserved by figures like Joe DiMaggio and Ted Williams, both of whom served but returned to resume their careers with legendary flourish. Football, by contrast, had been gutted. Now it needed heroes again, men who could capture headlines and draw crowds back into stadiums. Into that vacuum stepped returning veterans whose service became part of their legend. Chuck Bednarik, who had flown 30 combat missions over Europe as a gunner in a B-24 bomber, returned to play for the Philadelphia Eagles. Nicknamed Concrete Charlie, he embodied both toughness and resilience, bridging the worlds of soldier and athlete. Bednarik's career would stretch into the 1960s, making him one of the last Ironmen of football, but his beginnings were marked indelibly by war. Stories like Bednarik's gave the NFL an aura of authenticity. These were not pampered athletes playing a child's game. These were warriors who had faced death and returned to bring the same ferocity to the gridiron. Their presence reassured fans that football mirrored the grit and sacrifice of the broader American experience. But the post-war years also revealed fractures. Some veterans resented the triviality of sport after enduring the magnitude of war. A few walked away entirely, unwilling to chase touchdowns when comrades lay buried in foreign soil. Others carried invisible wounds that fans could not see. Nightmares, flashbacks, restlessness that no amount of cheering could cure. In the silence of locker rooms, teammates noticed their 1,000-yard stares, their quick tempers, their inability to celebrate victories with uncomplicated joy. The NFL, like the nation, struggled to address these realities. Psychological trauma was rarely discussed. Coaches expected players to toughen up, to compartmentalize. Sports writers celebrated grit but rarely acknowledged vulnerability. In this way, the league mirrored post-war America's broader tendency to bury pain beneath the narrative of triumph. The returning veteran was celebrated as a hero, but his suffering often went unspoken. And yet, despite these contradictions, football grew. Attendance surged in the late 1940s, fueled by a population eager for distraction, community, and symbols of resilience. The league expanded, experimented with new rules, and slowly began transforming into the cultural juggernaut it would become. Much of that growth rested on the shoulders of men who had fought in uniform. Their reputations burnished not just by touchdowns, but by military service. In honoring them, however unevenly, the NFL tied itself permanently to the American military narrative. Stadium ceremonies linked patriotism to sport, reinforcing the idea that football was not just a game, but a reflection of national character. The gridiron became a symbolic battlefield where discipline, sacrifice, and brotherhood were rehearsed before crowds. In a sense, every kickoff carried an echo of Normandy. Every tackle an echo of Iwo Jima. This intertwining of football and the military would only deepen in decades to come. But it began in earnest during these immediate post-war years. Without the sacrifices of those who served, and the memory of those who never returned, the league might not have survived. Instead, it endured, scarred yet stronger, built on foundations of loss and resilience. The cost was enormous, and it was unevenly paid. For every Chuck Bednarik who returned to glory, There was an Alblosies whose story ended in a forest in France. For every team that welcomed home a veteran star, another carried the quiet grief of permanent absence. This tension between triumph and tragedy, between survival and sacrifice, became part of the NFL's DNA. And so, in the late 1940s, as new rookies entered the league and veterans laced up cleats once more, football carried with it the shadows of war. Fans might cheer touchdowns and gasp at tackles, but somewhere in the background lingered the names of the fallen, reminders that the sport had nearly been consumed by global conflict. But as the NFL re-established itself at home, the world beyond America's borders had changed forever. The question remained, how would football, a uniquely American sport, adapt to a new era defined not by depression or war, but by prosperity, technology, and the looming Cold War? The war had ended, but America's fight was far from over. By the late 1940s, the sound of gunfire no longer echoed from Europe or the Pacific. Instead, it pulsed through a new conflict, one colder, subtler, but no less consuming. The United States stood face to face with the Soviet Union in an ideological struggle that demanded constant displays of strength, unity, and discipline. And in that crucible, football emerged as more than entertainment. It became a cultural weapon, a mirror of America's resilience and a symbol of the values the nation believed distinguished it from its enemies. The NFL was not yet the colossus it would become. Stadiums were smaller. Television was just beginning to flicker into living rooms, and attendance numbers, though rising, still paled in comparison to baseball's dominance. Yet there was something about football that resonated with post-war America. It was tough, it was organized. It required collective sacrifice for the good of the team. In those years, when citizens were told to prepare for nuclear drills, conserve resources, and stand ready for a long, twilight struggle, football felt like the sport that best embodied the national mood. Returning veterans filled rosters, and with them came not only skill, but stories. Every tackle, every block, every bruised rib carried a sense of authenticity born from real combat. Fans looked at players and saw not just athletes, but men who had served, men who had already proven themselves on a battlefield larger than any gridiron. This lent football a gravitas that baseball, for all its glory, could not quite match. It is not that baseball lacked veterans, it had plenty, but the physicality of football, the collisions that seemed to mimic war's violence, made it uniquely suited to symbolize post-war toughness. The league leaned into that image. Coaches and owners spoke of discipline, strategy, and sacrifice in language that mirrored military training manuals. Paul Brown, whose Cleveland Browns had dominated the All-America Football Conference before entering the NFL in 1950, explicitly modeled his coaching style on his experiences running Navy teams during the war. He demanded precision, playbooks memorized like field orders, and players drilled until they could execute formations as if they were maneuvers in combat. His system turned the Browns into a dynasty and provided the NFL with a template for professionalism in the new era. Meanwhile, the league's culture of remembrance persisted. Moments of silence before games honored the dead of World War II. But now those gestures also served another purpose, reminding fans of the values at stake in the unfolding Cold War. Patriotism saturated stadiums. Flags unfurled, anthems played, and the sport became a weekly ritual of unity in uncertain times. For fans who had lived through the Depression, then war, and now entered a new global rivalry, football provided reassurance. It was proof that America's grit, forged in trenches and beaches, could thrive in peacetime as well. Yet beneath a patriotic veneer lay a harsher reality. Many veterans carried invisible wounds. Post-traumatic stress, though not recognized by that name, shaped the lives of players trying to adjust to normalcy. Nightmares haunted them. Sudden noises triggered memories of shellfire, coped with alcohol, others with silence. The NFL, like the broader society, had little vocabulary for these struggles. The demand was always to be tough, to get up after every hit, to never show weakness. For many, the field became both therapy and torment, a place to channel aggression, but also a reminder of battles never fully left behind. The fans, though, saw only the spectacle. They filled stadiums in growing numbers, their cheers mixing nostalgia with anticipation. Families who had rationed sugar and gasoline during the war now bought hot dogs and tickets, indulging in leisure that felt almost defiant after years of sacrifice. For them, football was not just a sport. It was a declaration that America had survived, that it was thriving, that life could be both hard and joyous at once. Technology, too, began to change the landscape. Television entered the picture in the late 1940s, still primitive but powerful enough to bring football into American homes. The sports violence, compressed into grainy black and white images, captivated audiences. Baseball may have been the national pastime, but football was television's future. The NFL, sensing opportunity, began to align itself with this medium, planting seeds that would eventually blossom into the billion-dollar spectacle we know today. But in these years, between 1945 and the early 1950s, the league was still fragile. It had expanded with the return of veterans, but it was also competing with the All-America Football Conference, which poached talent and tested loyalties. Financial stability was far from guaranteed. Owners debated how to keep stadiums full and how to market a game still seen by many as brutal and niche compared to baseball. The Cold War, paradoxically, offered both a challenge and an opportunity. On one hand, economic uncertainty and public fear could have shrunk the sport. On the other, football's militaristic metaphors fit perfectly into the language of the times. When the Browns entered the NFL in 1950 and immediately won the championship, critics scoffed at the league's competitiveness. But the Browns' dominance also showed the possibilities of innovation and discipline, values prized in a society that feared falling behind the Soviet Union. The Cold War demanded technological and organizational superiority. Paul Brown's methods gave football its version of both. At the same time, the league began to integrate slowly, though unevenly. African American players had been excluded for much of the 1930s and early 1940s, but by 1946, the color line was broken with the reintegration of Kenny Washington and Woody Strode, soon followed by Marion Motley and Bill Willis with the Browns. Their presence was not just athletic, but symbolic. In an America claiming moral superiority over communist regimes, showcasing racial progress became part of the ideological battle. Football, whether consciously or not, played a role in projecting that image, even as discrimination persisted behind the scenes. The late 1940s thus stand as a pivotal moment in the NFL's history. It was a time when war's shadow still hung heavy, but new lights, television, prosperity, cultural influence began to shine through. Players carried both medals and helmets, embodying the bridge between battlefield and gridiron. Fans brought both grief and hope into stadiums, cheering for touchdowns while remembering names etched in war memorials. The league itself balanced between fragility and growth, between memory and ambition. Looking back, it is clear that football's rise in these years was not inevitable. It was shaped by the war, by the Cold War, by cultural hunger for symbols of endurance. Without those forces, the NFL might have remained a marginal sport, a curiosity rather than a cornerstone. Instead, it became part of America's identity, tied not just to Sunday afternoons, but to the nation's understanding of itself in a dangerous new world. And yet, as the 1950s approached, new questions loomed. Could the NFL move beyond the weight of its wartime legacy? Could it build a future without being forever defined by the sacrifices of the past? The league had survived depression, war, and rivalry. But survival was only the beginning. The next challenge would be growth, legitimacy, and the transformation from a game of veterans to a sport of professionals watched by millions. The 1950s were supposed to be the decade of innocence. At least, that's the myth America likes to tell itself. Suburban lawns neatly trimmed, white picket fences stretching down new housing developments. The hum of television sets glowing in living rooms where fathers read newspapers and mothers baked pies. But behind that carefully constructed portrait, another story unfolded, one that included the National Football League. I was there in the archives, turning through brittle newspapers and reels of film, trying to understand how the league emerged from near irrelevance into something far greater. The answer, as always, was layered in contradictions. On the one hand, the NFL entered living rooms across the nation, its games broadcast into homes that had never seen a stadium. On the other, it carried with it the ghosts of war. The brutality of men hardened by combat and the psychological scars that never quite faded. Television was the key. By 1951, the league signed its first national broadcast contract, a deal with the Dumont Television Network. It was modest money, but it meant something bigger than cash. For the first time, professional football no longer depended solely on ticket sales or radio voices describing plays you had to imagine. Now the images were right there on the screen, bright and white but alive. A tackle wasn't just words, it was bodies colliding in front of your eyes. Families sat together on Sunday afternoons, the glow of the set washing over them, and they saw heroes being created in real time. Otto Graham, the steady hand of the Cleveland Browns. Doak Walker, the golden boy of the Detroit Lions, and later, the fierce presence of players like Gino Marchetti, who carried himself like a man still marching out of Europe in uniform. These were not just athletes, they were symbols, avatars of strength in a country that wanted to project stability after years of upheaval. Yet that veneer of stability hid an uncomfortable truth. Many of the league's players were veterans of World War II or the Korean conflict. They brought battlefield instincts to the gridiron. They hit harder. They played through pain. They carried themselves with the knowledge that a broken rib or a concussion was nothing compared to trench, fire, or frozen nights on the 38th parallel. I read accounts of men like Chuck Bednarik, the Philadelphia Eagles Ironman, who seemed almost unbreakable. He played both ways, center on offense, linebacker on defense, and he relished the violence. Bednarik had flown combat missions as a gunner in the war. For him, football was not a game. It was a continuation of combat, just on turf instead of fields of mud. Watching him crash into ball carriers, you could almost see the shadows of B-24 bombers etched across his back. This merging of war and sport shaped the decade's identity. The league was marketed as entertainment, something clean and consumable for the new television audience. But the men at its core played with a darkness that television could not fully conceal. Hits were savage, and the injuries were mounting. Bones snapped on camera. Helmets, still little more than thin shells, did little to protect skulls from colliding. And concussions, though rarely called that at the time, were brushed off with a sniff of smelling salts and a shove back into the huddle. Television did not sanitize the violence. Instead, it amplified it. Slow-motion replays were still years away, but even the raw footage carried a kind of awe. Fans at home could not believe what they were seeing: men being slammed into the frozen ground, helmets popping loose, mud caked across uniforms until numbers were unreadable. In a decade obsessed with order, television football was a reminder that chaos always lurked just beneath the surface. The 1958 NFL Championship, later dubbed the greatest game ever played, was the culmination of that marriage between sport and screen. Millions watched as the Baltimore Colts defeated the New York Giants in sudden death overtime. And in that instant, the NFL went from being just another sport to being a cultural cornerstone. Johnny Unitas became the face of cool resilience, marching his team down the field with precision. Alan Amici's winning touchdown etched itself into memory, not just because of what happened on the field, but because it was televised. It was proof that the game could create national moments, shared experiences that united strangers across states. But even in that moment of triumph, the league could not escape its shadows. Many of the players in that game bore injuries from earlier battles, both military and football. Some limped onto the field. Others played through concussions that would haunt them years later. The public saw the spectacle, but the players lived the cost. Their bodies, already worn by war, were being dismantled piece by piece on camera. And then there was the matter of race. Television forced the NFL to confront what had long been a quiet problem. Integration was slow, uneven, and often resisted by team owners who clung to old prejudices. Black players were present, but opportunities were limited, and the camera revealed both their brilliance and the inequities they faced. Men like Willie Gallimore and Ali Matson played with grace and speed, but behind the scenes they endured segregated hotels and whispered slurs. The NFL wanted to present itself as modern, yet its treatment of players of color revealed how much of the past still lingered. The 1950s, then, were not a golden era as they are often remembered. They were a decade of transition, of contradictions. Television made the game national, but it also froze the league in time, capturing its brutality and inequities on screen for all to see. Heroes were made, but those heroes were often broken men, their bodies sacrificed for moments of glory. When I watch the grainy footage today, what strikes me is not the plays themselves, but the faces of the players as they walked off the field. Some smiled for the cameras, but many stared blankly, eyes hollow, their bodies stiff as if bracing for another collision. They were men caught between two worlds, one of public adoration and one of private pain. Television gave the NFL the stage it needed to become a giant, but it also locked the players into roles they could never escape. They were gladiators for a suburban audience that wanted spectacle without consequence. And for the league, that was the trade-off that ensured survival. Sacrifice the players, but secure the brand. I can't help but think about how the war never really ended for many of those men. It simply shifted arenas. They came home from Europe or Korea and put on helmets instead of helmets of steel, uniforms of fabric instead of camouflage. But the mission was the same: advance, hit, endure. In a way, the 1950s NFL was less about football and more about America learning how to watch violence packaged as entertainment, broadcast into living rooms with the promise that it was all just a game. That promise carried the league forward, even as the cost to the players deepened. The 1960s would build on that momentum, pushing football into the heart of American culture. But the foundation had already been laid, and it was built on sacrifice of bodies, of fairness, of truth. The war was over. The games were on television. And yet, the shadows never left. But the 1960s would reveal something new: television no longer just showed the game. It shaped it, bending the NFL into the cultural juggernaut that would define an entire generation. The 1960s were supposed to be America's decade of confidence. The war in Europe was nearly 2 decades behind. The economy was booming. And the United States had positioned itself as the unquestioned superpower of the free world. But just beneath that surface of prosperity lay turbulence. Civil rights marches filled the streets. Vietnam crept into the headlines and then into living rooms. Assassinations shattered the myth of national stability. And all the while, professional football was transforming from a niche pastime into the country's defining spectacle. It was in this crucible of change that the NFL carved its modern identity. Television was no longer a novelty, was the household altar of American life. And football, more than any other sport, was built for the screen. The violence, the collisions, the slow build of tension before every snap, it all translated perfectly to broadcast. By the early 1960s, CBS, NBC, and ABC were bidding fiercely for rights packages. For the first time in its history, the NFL wasn't just surviving, it was competing for the nation's attention. But there was a cost to this spotlight. Many of the players filling those Sunday broadcasts had lived other lives before the camera found them. Veterans of Korea, sons of men lost in World War II. They carried the psychological residue of war into a league that now demanded performance, not just for a ticketed crowd, but for millions sitting at home. Some welcomed the attention. Others found it suffocating. What was once a game played in steel towns and muddy fields was now part of a national identity campaign. The NFL became the stage where America could prove its strength to itself, even as the nation fractured in real time. The story of Roosevelt Brown captures that complexity. Drafted by the New York Giants in 1953, he became one of the first great black linemen in league history. Brown's dominance helped pave the way for racial integration in a league still quietly grappling with segregationist pressures. By the mid-1960s, as civil rights activists faced dogs and fire hoses in Birmingham, black stars like Brown, Jim Brown, and Willie would force football fans to confront uncomfortable truths. They weren't simply athletes. They were symbols of progress, resilience, and the contradiction of an America that celebrated black excellence on the field while denying equality off it. Then there was Bart Starr, the Green Bay quarterback whose calm precision seemed immune to the turbulence of the era. Starr was not a combat veteran, but many of his linemen had served in Korea. He often spoke of their discipline, their unflinching ability to execute under pressure. They carried themselves differently, Starr once reflected. Football never shook them. They had seen too much already. That sentiment was shared across locker rooms. War had molded men who treated football not as battle, but as ritual, a far safer form of danger. Yet Vietnam cast a darker shadow. While college campuses erupted in protest, football's culture demanded a different posture. The sport leaned heavily on patriotism. Pre-game ceremonies swelled with military color guards, national anthems boomed louder, and halftime shows praised the troops overseas. But beneath that pageantry, contradictions grew. Some young players were drafted into service, forced to leave careers behind. Others deferred or found exemptions, igniting whispers in locker rooms. And as casualties mounted in Southeast Asia, the metaphor of football as war began to sour. For the first time, fans questioned whether comparing Sunday collisions to combat was honorable or insulting. The league's expansion mirrored the country's ambition. By the late 1960s, the merger between the NFL and the upstart AFL was underway. It promised a new era of unity, of television contracts that would cement football as the #1 sport in America. The first Super Bowl in 1967 was marketed as spectacle, but beneath the pageantry was desperation. A league trying to knit together a fractured nation with the promise of entertainment. Every broadcast, every halftime show, carried the weight of a country asking, could football still be our safe escape? The players bore that tension on their shoulders. Stories circulated of veterans who, after games, sat in silence in locker rooms, lost in memories they never shared with teammates. Others embraced the celebrity culture of the era, becoming household names and national spokesmen. But whether quiet or outspoken, every player became part of something bigger. Football was no longer just a sport. It was America's mirror. Consider Jim Brown. By the mid-1960s, he was not just the most dominant running back the league had ever seen. He was also a cultural force. Brown spoke openly about racial injustice, about the hypocrisy of a nation cheering him on Sundays while denying rights to his community on Mondays. His decision to retire early in 1966, at the height of his powers, shocked the league. But for Brown, football was only one stage in a larger struggle. He embodied the collision between the NFL's growing fame and the era's demands for social change. Meanwhile, coaches like Vince Lombardi symbolized a different kind of leadership. Lombardi's Green Bay Packers became dynastic, not just because of talent, but because of discipline forged in values that felt almost martial. Lombardi, the son of a Brooklyn butcher, often invoked sacrifice, loyalty, and endurance virtues not far removed from military ideals. In his locker rooms, players from different backgrounds learned to buy into a single vision. Too many. Lombardi's Packers were a metaphor for what America aspired to be. Unified, resilient, unstoppable. But even Lombardi could not hold back the tides of change. By the end of the decade, his own players were negotiating salaries more aggressively, questioning authority, and reflecting the cultural shifts happening everywhere outside Lambeau Field. Television magnified every moment. When the Dallas Cowboys rose to prominence, they weren't just a team, they were branded America's team, a title heavy with political meaning. Their clean-cut image contrasted with the unrest spilling onto nightly news. To millions of fans, tuning in to watch Don Meredith or Bob Lilly provided relief from images of protests and body counts. The NFL understood this dynamic and leaned into it. Football was marketed as order in an era of chaos, discipline in an age of rebellion. But here lies the irony. The very players paraded as symbols of order were often men who had seen or lived through disorder themselves. Some were children of Depression-era veterans. Some had served in uniform. Others bore the weight of segregation and systemic injustice. And together they played a game that asked them to sacrifice their bodies for glory that often outlived their names. By the close of the 1960s, the NFL had become more than sport. It was spectacle, ritual, and national bomb. But it was also something else, a stage where America worked through its contradictions. War and peace, equality and injustice, fame and anonymity. To watch the league was to watch the country argue with itself. And as the Vietnam War dragged on, that tension would only grow. The 1970 merger between the NFL and AFL loomed like a promise of stability, but the truth was clear. Football had become America's dominant sport, not in spite of the era's turbulence, but because of it. Fans needed something to hold on to. The NFL gave them a Sunday sanctuary, a ritual that made the country feel whole even as it fractured in every other way. The war scars had not disappeared. They had simply been absorbed into the mythology of the game. And the men who carried them, veterans, sons, brothers, continued to collide on the field week after week, playing for something larger than themselves. The 1970s opened with a moment that defined the trajectory of professional football: the merger of the NFL and the AFL. On paper, it was a business decision, the end of a costly war between rival leagues. But in reality, it was much more than that. The merger symbolized unity in a time when America itself was splintered. The Vietnam War still raged, civil rights battles pressed forward, and a nation weary of assassinations and unrest looked for places to feel whole. Football provided that space, and the newly unified NFL was perfectly positioned to become not just a sport, but the beating heart of American identity. When Commissioner Pete Rozelle stood at the podium to announce the new alignment of teams, he wasn't simply outlining schedules and divisions. He was delivering a kind of national reassurance. 32 franchises from coast to coast would now operate under one banner. The Super Bowl, just 4 years old, would become the grand unifier, the annual ritual where the country gathered regardless of politics, religion, or geography. Football was now America's game, and the league's leaders understood the symbolic power they held. But beneath that sense of order, players lived in a reality as turbulent as the country itself. Many had grown up in the shadows of World War II. Some had served in Korea, and now, in the early years of the 1970s, others faced the draft for Vietnam. While most NFL players found deferments or exemptions, a few did see combat, and the specter of war hung over locker rooms, just as it hung over college campuses. Young men who strapped on helmets each Sunday, new classmates, cousins, and neighbors who strapped on military gear instead. The parallels were unavoidable. Football's language reflected that connection. Coaches spoke of battles, trenches, and casualties. Games were described as wars of attrition. For decades, those metaphors had sounded noble. But in the Vietnam era, when television beamed images of body bags into living rooms, the words grew heavier. Some fans recoiled at the idea of comparing a quarterback sack to real sacrifice. Yet others leaned into it, seeing football as the last safe place where war could be simulated without loss of life. Take the Pittsburgh Steelers, for example. Before the merger, they were a struggling franchise, often mocked for their futility. But in the 1970s, they transformed into a dynasty. Their style of play was relentless, violent, punishing football in its most primal form. For a blue-collar city hammered by industrial decline, the Steelers became a symbol of grit and endurance. But for veterans who filled the stands at Three Rivers Stadium, there was another layer. Watching Mean Joe Green and Jack Lambert demolish opponents felt like watching warriors who fought for them, carrying the city's pride into battle. Meanwhile, on the West Coast, the Oakland Raiders cultivated a different identity. Under Al Davis, they became the outlaws of the league, embracing individuality and defiance. Many of their players were Vietnam-era men, skeptical of authority, brash in personality. The Raiders embodied a cultural shift in America, the rise of counterculture within the framework of a violent game. For some, they were villains. For others, they were the most authentic expression of the times. The merger also redefined the economics of the league. Television contracts exploded. Advertisers poured money into broadcasts, knowing that Sunday football guaranteed millions of viewers. Rozelle, shrewd and visionary, transformed the NFL into a marketing juggernaut. Yet that money rarely reached the men on the field. Most players still worked second jobs in the offseason. Injuries piled up, and medical support remained rudimentary. In many ways, the players sacrificed their bodies in ways eerily reminiscent of soldiers, expendable for the larger cause of national entertainment. In locker rooms, veterans of real wars occasionally pulled younger teammates aside. They reminded them that football was a gift, not combat. But they also acknowledged the psychological parallels. The adrenaline rush, the brotherhood, the willingness to play through penet all felt familiar. As one unnamed veteran put it, you hear the crowd, you feel the collision, and for a split second, you remember. You remember the noise, the fear, and then the relief that you're still alive. Those private confessions rarely left locker rooms, but they shaped the way teammates bonded. The Super Bowl became the crown jewel of this new era. What began as an experiment between rival leagues now grew into a cultural holiday. Families gathered, advertisers debuted iconic commercials, and the halftime show became a spectacle unto itself. The game was marketed as larger than life, a unifying ritual in a divided nation. Yet even here, war's shadow lingered. National anthems grew longer, military flyovers louder, and the NFL leaned into its identity as the patriotic stage of American life. The 1970s were not without tragedy. Players continued to suffer devastating injuries, often untreated or ignored. The long-term toll of concussions remained invisible, but the consequences would surface decades later. Some veterans of the era struggled silently with trauma, their war experiences compounded by football's violence. Others transitioned into coaching or broadcasting, carrying their scars privately. The public saw the glory. The men lived with the pain. And then came one of the decade. As darkest moments, the death of Chuck Hughes in 1971, a wide receiver for the Detroit Lions. Hughes collapsed on the field from a heart attack during a game against the Chicago Bears. He was just 28 years old. For fans and players alike, it was a chilling reminder that football was not simply metaphorical war. It carried real risks, real consequences. Hughes's death became part of the league's hidden casualties, a reminder that the game's brutality could claim lives even without a battlefield. Yet the league marched on, and its cultural power only grew. By the end of the decade, the NFL had overtaken baseball as America's true pastime. Monday Night Football became a weekly ritual, introducing millions of viewers to the drama of prime time. Broadcasters like Howard Cosell turned games into national conversations. And with every broadcast, the mythology deepened. Football was America's defining spectacle. The place where sacrifice, violence, and triumph played out in controlled chaos. Looking back, the 1970s represented more than just the rise of a sport. They revealed how football absorbed the traumas and contradictions of its time. The league became a stage where veterans found echoes of their past, where fans sought order amidst national turmoil, and where players sacrificed bodies and futures for fleeting glory. It was a decade where football cemented itself not just as entertainment, but as America's most powerful cultural mirror. And as the nation stumbled toward the 1980s scarred by Vietnam, shaken by Watergate, hungry for renewal, the NFL was ready to carry more than the ball. It was ready to carry the country's identity itself. The 1980s arrived like a thunderclap. America was changing, and the NFL was about to ride that change into a kind of dominance no one could have imagined a generation earlier. The league that once fought for survival during wartime, that clawed its way into the national conversation during the turbulent 60s and 70s, now stood ready to become the central stage of American life. But the ascent was not just about touchdowns and trophies. It was about identity, politics, money, and the lingering shadows of wars that never fully left the men who played the game. By the early 1980s, television wasn't just broadcasting football, it was building it. Monday Night Football had become an institution, a ritual embedded in American households. The merger of sport and spectacle grew tighter with every broadcast. Corporate sponsors lined up to attach their names to games, halftime shows, and championship moments. The Super Bowl, once just a novelty after the NFL-LA-FL merger, now became a cultural holiday, an annual celebration of American power and prosperity. But prosperity in the NFL did not erase the scars of the past. Many of the men coaching on sidelines, working in front offices, or commentating from broadcast booths carried with them histories forged in World War II and Korea. Their values, discipline, loyalty, sacrifice became the ethos of teams they guided. Their experiences shaped how they spoke to players, how they demanded toughness, how they interpreted the game itself. For them, football was never just football. It was a way to instill order in a world that could collapse without warning. The league leaned heavily into patriotism during the Cold War. National anthems before games swelled with orchestral power. Military flyovers shook stadiums. The imagery was deliberate. Football became a symbolic front in America's ideological conflict with the Soviet Union. To celebrate the NFL was, in a sense, to celebrate the resilience of the United States. The players, though, bore the contradictions. They weren't soldiers, but the culture around them often treated them as such. Every sack, every hit, every season-ending injury was packaged as part of the warrior-esque sacrifice for the team and the fans. No figure embodied the decade's contradictions better than Joe Montana. Calm/surgical and unstoppable under pressure, Montana guided the San Francisco 49ers into a dynasty. His grace under fire made him a Cold War hero of sorts. The cool American, unflinching, victorious. Yet even Montana's linemen and teammates carried the physical toll of the game in ways eerily reminiscent of battlefield wounds. Knees shredded, shoulders torn, concussions brushed aside. The NFL was selling perfection on television while hiding the broken bodies that made it possible. Then there was Lawrence Taylor, whose ferocity as a linebacker for the New York Giants redefined defense itself. Taylor played with a reckless abandon that electrified fans and terrified opponents. He was marketed as a gladiator, a warrior with no equal. Yet behind the imagery lay a reality. He, like many players, carried his own battles. Some internal, some physical, some born of a culture that demanded pain be ignored in the pursuit of dominance. The 1980s also ushered in the rise of free agency battles and labor disputes. Players began demanding more better pay, better benefits, acknowledgement of their sacrifices. The strikes of 1982 and 1987 weren't just about money. They were about recognition. For decades, players had been treated like expendable soldiers, useful only as long as they could perform. Now, in a booming league flush with television contracts and corporate sponsorships, they wanted their share. The echoes of wartime sacrifice were everywhere. Men who had given everything, only to find themselves discarded when their bodies failed. And yet, through all the turmoil, football's grip on America tightened. Games like the 1985 Chicago Bears' season-dominant, charismatic, unforgettable captured the imagination of a country hungry for heroes. The Bears' defense was marketed like an army, a unit so fierce that it felt unstoppable. Their Super Bowl victory wasn't just a win for Chicago. It was packaged as proof of American might, broadcast to millions, reinforcing the NFL's role as cultural spectacle. But not every story was celebratory. Many veterans of earlier decades watched from the sidelines, seeing the game they once played transformed into a billion-dollar industry. Some struggled with bitterness, knowing they had sacrificed their health for a league that now seemed untouchable in its wealth. Others found themselves honored at halftime ceremonies. Their wartime service folded neatly into the NFL's narrative of patriotism. Yet behind the applause, some carried pain no tribute could erase. The Super Bowl of the 1980s grew into a phenomenon of excess giant stadiums, halftime extravaganzas, commercials that cost fortunes. But even amid the glamour, the underlying themes remained familiar: sacrifice, struggle, survival. The war metaphors didn't disappear, they only grew louder. Commentators still spoke of blitzes, trenches, and battles. Fans still embraced the imagery, even as veterans of real wars sat in those same stadiums, remembering the difference between metaphor and reality. What made the decade remarkable was not simply the NFL's growth, but its ability to weave itself into America's cultural fabric. When Ronald Reagan invoked the resilience of the American people, it resonated with the same themes fans heard on Sundays. Football became proof of national endurance, a safe stage where the chaos of the outside world could be controlled, packaged, and celebrated. It wasn't accidental, it was design. By the close of the decade, the NFL stood as an empire. Television contracts were astronomical. Stadiums expanded, merchandise flooded stores. And the players, once overlooked, now became national celebrities, household names whose faces sold everything from shoes to soda. Yet beneath the glitter, the reality was sobering. The injuries, the concussions, the quiet retirements, they were the league's hidden costs, the unspoken casualties of a system built on sacrifice. The 1980s proved something profound. Football had become America's defining ritual, a weekly ceremony of unity, spectacle, and controlled violence. But like the wars that shaped its past, it carried with it casualties, men, broken by the very system they elevated. The decade left the NFL not just bigger, but heavier, weighted with the responsibility of being more than a sport. It was now a mirror of the nation itself, reflecting its triumphs, contradictions, and costs. And as the league prepared to enter the 1990s, those contradictions would only sharpen. Fame brought scrutiny. Wealth brought resentment. And the myth of invincibility that football sold to the world would soon collide with truths too heavy to ignore. When the war ended, the NFL did not return to the same league that had marched into it. Rosters filled again, stadiums hummed again, and the headlines shifted back to touchdowns, rivalries, and championships. But beneath the celebration, there were missing faces, men who had been drafted into service and never came back. Some were buried in foreign soil, their names etched into marble far from the fields they once commanded. Others returned broken, carrying injuries and memories that made a professional football career impossible. And yet, in the public story the NFL told, these absences were rarely confronted directly. The silence around them became its own kind of shadow. The league had a choice in those years: confront the reality of loss, or reshape it into a patriotic narrative that made the sport seem inseparable from America's war effort. In the process, the real human cost to families who lost breadwinners. The teammates who never played again were muted beneath the sound of patriotic marketing. Consider Howard Smiley Johnson, a New York Giants lineman who died on Iwo Jima. The Giants mentioned him, yes. But within a season, the machine of professional football had moved forward. Fans were asked to remember victory, not absence. The league used men like Johnson as reminders of football's contribution to America's triumph. Yet behind the rhetoric were widows, children, and teammates grappling with the reality that their friend was gone forever. The silence became most noticeable when you compared the NFL to baseball. Major League Baseball maintained a more public register of service. Stars like Ted Williams, Joe DiMaggio, and Bob Feller were celebrated not only as athletes, but as servicemen, their names tied forever to the war. Baseball created memorials, special games, and historical narratives that gave its wartime sacrifices a permanent home. Football, by contrast, downplayed its losses. Part of it was scale. The NFL was smaller, less secure, still fighting for relevance in American culture. But part of it was deliberate framing. The league wanted to project resilience, continuity, and growth. And the best way to do that was not to linger on the players who were gone, but to focus on the idea that football itself had helped America win. It was here, in the late 1940s, that the NFL perfected a form of storytelling that has lasted to this day. By tying itself to the flag, the military, and the myth of sacrifice, it found a way to elevate its brand beyond sport. The players who never returned from Europe or the Pacific were not remembered as men. First, they were remembered as football, as contribution to a national cause. Their humanity was flattened into a line of patriotic imagery. And for the players who did return but never recovered, the silence was even deeper. Men like Joe Rout, an All-American lineman killed in action, or Jack Lummis, the Giants' end who earned the Medal of Honor posthumously, were publicly lionized. But what of the men who survived and limped back into civilian life, never able to strap on pads again? Their struggles were not part of the NFL's narrative. The league rarely spoke of them, rarely offered support, rarely framed their absence as anything more than the natural cost of war. In locker rooms, though, the silence was loud. Teammates returned to find friends missing. Veterans carried both pride and grief, knowing the man next to them might never have another chance at a snap. Some spoke of it only in private: 2 wives, 2 close friends, or never at all. For them, the war had not been a marketing story. It had been nights in foxholes, days under artillery fire, months on ships waiting for an uncertain landing. And when they came back to football, it was not just a game, it was a reminder of what had been lost. This gap between private memory and public narrative is what makes the NFL's wartime story so complicated. The league, desperate to prove itself in the post-war boom, leaned into patriotism. It emphasized the idea that football built men strong enough to win wars. It used military imagery in advertising. It leaned on slogans that connected toughness on the field with bravery in battle. What it did not do was center the human grief of absence. That was left to families and communities to carry alone. But if you look closely, you can see the ghosts. A team photo with a missing figure. A roster where a name quietly disappeared. An empty locker never officially acknowledged. These silences tell their own story, of men who gave everything, and a league that could not afford to dwell too long on death if it wanted to sell life, excitement, and the next season of games. By the 1950s, the NFL had grown into a confident enterprise. Television arrived, stars emerged, championships captured national attention. And yet, even as the league basked in its new role as America's rising sport, the names of the fallen receded further. When the league spoke of its wartime connection, it spoke of patriotism, not tragedy. It highlighted victory, not absence. It celebrated the resilience of the game itself, not the irreplaceable loss of the men who had played it. This was the NFL's post-war deal, to claim the symbolic glory of sacrifice while leaving the real human stories largely untold. It is why so many of these players are forgotten today, their names absent from the league's official history. They were real men, with real families, whose lives were cut short or forever altered. But their stories were overshadowed by a narrative designed to make football seem larger than life, an institution too vital to be defined by loss. And so, we are left with a haunting dual truth. On one side, the players who never returned, their absence felt most acutely by those who knew them best. On the other, a league that converted their deaths into fuel for its own rise, weaving patriotism into its brand while leaving the deeper reckoning untouched. This silence is as much a part of the NFL's dark side as the violence on the field or the physical toll on players. It is the silence of memory, the silence of marketing triumph over mourning. But silence never erases reality. And if we listen closely enough, we can still hear the echo of those missing voices, reminding us that behind every patriotic story is a human life cut short, a human cost left unspoken. When the guns fell silent in 1945, America was a nation eager to move forward. Soldiers returned home, industries shifted from tanks to cars, and optimism flooded the air like a spring thaw after a long winter. For the National Football League, this was not just a moment of relief, it was an opportunity. The war had paused the league's momentum, but it had not destroyed it. And now, with the country entering a new era of prosperity, the NFL saw its chance to transform itself from a niche sport into a national spectacle. But in its rush toward the future, something vital was left behind. The men who had gone overseas, who had risked everything, returned to find a league that had little interest in dwelling on the past. The NFL wanted to modernize, to expand, to build television contracts and corporate partnerships. Veterans who limped back with wounds physical or invisible did not fit neatly into that story. The league honored them with gestures, but it did not restructure itself to support them. The machine of professional football pressed forward, fueled by ambition rather than reflection. In those early post-war seasons, the contrast was striking. On Sunday afternoons, stadiums filled with fans ready to cheer. The sound of marching bands and crowd roars replaced the echoes of wartime radio reports. Newspapers framed football as proof of America's return to normalcy. But for the players who had lived through Normandy, Okinawa, or the Ardennes, this normal was anything but. They carried memories of death and loss, but the NFL was not a place for remembering it, was a place for spectacle. Take the case of Chuck Bednarik. He returned from flying 30 missions over Europe with the 8th Air Force, decorated and battle-hardened. To the public, he was celebrated as the quintessential tough man, the perfect face for a league obsessed with resilience. But what was rarely discussed was how little transition support men like Bednarik received. They were expected to lace up, perform, and sell tickets, as if war had been just another training camp. The complexity of their experiences was reduced to a single narrative: warriors in uniform becoming warriors on the gridiron. This narrative was profitable. It gave fans a story to believe in, a clean bridge from battlefield to ballfield. But it also meant that the darker truths, the nightmares, the lingering injuries, the veterans who could not make the roster again, were quietly erased. In the official version, the NFL had not lost men. It had produced heroes. And in this telling, the league's continuity became its greatest achievement. Behind the scenes, however, players noticed the shift. The league was growing more corporate, more image-conscious, more focused on building a product than honoring the men who had carried its name into war. Contracts remained stingy. Medical support was minimal. Veterans were treated as athletes first, employees second, and men with trauma barely at all. For every Bednarik who thrived, there were others who faded into obscurity. Their names remembered only in family stories and hometown memorials. The drive to modernize was relentless. The late 1940s and early 1950s saw the NFL expand its media presence, strike radio deals, and prepare for television's arrival. The focus was on stars, championships, and market growth. The league leaned heavily into narratives of toughness and spectacle, which made sense for a business trying to captivate a nation. But in doing so, it created a selective memory. The war years were reframed not as a time of sacrifice and loss, but as a chapter that proved football as importance to the American spirit. This was the Cold Return, a return defined not by grief or commemoration, but by acceleration. America itself mirrored this. Cities exploded with suburban growth, industries retooled for consumer goods. Families bought homes, cars, and televisions at unprecedented rates. The nation wanted optimism, not reflection. And the NFL, always attuned to public mood, followed that current. But for the veterans within its ranks, the contrast could be jarring. Imagine stepping onto a field in front of 40,000 fans, the cheers deafening. The game fast and furious, sound remembering, just a year earlier, crouching in silence under artillery fire. The dissonance was real. Yet the league offered no language for it, no acknowledgement beyond the occasional patriotic ceremony. It was as if football existed in a parallel reality, where war was a background chapter and the future was the only thing worth chasing. The business side made this clear. The league's leadership, men like Bert Bell, focused on stabilizing franchises, negotiating revenue, and establishing draft rules. Their eyes were on survival and growth, not on veterans' care. In this sense, the NFL's post-war boom was both a triumph and a betrayal. It succeeded in embedding itself into American culture, but it did so by leaving behind the deeper human costs of the war it had so often invoked. Some veterans spoke about this gap, in quiet interviews, in memoirs, in private letters. They expressed how strange it felt to see football become glitzier, more commercial, more detached from the sacrifices they and their teammates had made. They knew the league would not collapse had survived depression and war, but they wondered what it meant to survive without truly remembering. The Cold Return was not malicious. It was practical, calculated, and in line with the era's spirit. But it revealed something essential about the NFL's DNA, its instinct to prioritize growth over grief, spectacle over silence. That instinct would serve it well in decades to come as the league faced crises of violence, concussions, and labor disputes. But in the late 1940s, it meant that the men who had carried rifles overseas, who had bled and mourned, often returned to a game that had little space for their full humanity. And so, while fans celebrated football's post-war rise, the cost of that rise was borne quietly. Families grieved without recognition. Veterans played through pain without support. Names of the fallen slipped from public memory. The NFL had chosen its path. Forward, always forward, even if that meant the past became a ghost trailing silently behind. That is the paradox of the NFL's war years. It was both defined by sacrifice and eager to forget it. It built its future on the backs of men who had given everything but offered them little in return. And in doing so, it revealed the cold calculus of professional sport. That memory bends to marketing, and loss is absorbed into the spectacle until it fades away. In small towns across America, the war dead never disappeared. Their names were etched into stone memorials outside courthouses, carved into plaques at high school gyms. Read aloud every Memorial Day, for the families of NFL players who never came home. Grief was not a fleeting moment. It was a lifelong shadow. Parents kept letters folded in drawers. Wives raised children who barely knew their fathers. Brothers and teammates carried memories of faces that would never age. Yet, as the 1950s unfolded, the NFL itself moved further from this grief. The league did not deny it, but it folded it neatly into patriotic myth. Wartime sacrifice became part of football's lore, a chapter to be invoked on holidays or in commemorative articles. but rarely revisited in the messy, painful detail that families lived with every day. The NFL had always understood the power of narrative. In the post-war years, that meant leaning into a story of continuity, resilience, and patriotic pride. The league promoted the idea that football was America's game because it reflected the nation's toughness. Players who went to war were cast as natural extensions of this ideal. Soldiers on Sunday, soldiers abroad, then football players once again. But this neat framing concealed a harsher truth. Many of those who left never returned to play. Some were killed in combat. Others came back with wounds too severe to step on the field again. Still others carried invisible scars that made resuming normal life impossible. Their absence was felt deeply in households and hometowns, but on the national stage, their stories faded into background echoes. Meanwhile, the NFL was entering its golden age of visibility. With television spreading into American living rooms, the league became a staple of Sunday routines. Broadcasts often tied football to patriotism. The national anthem played before games with growing ritual. Military flyovers and halftime ceremonies celebrated the armed forces. On the screen, it seemed as though football and war shared a seamless bond. For families who had lost someone, this bond could be bittersweet. To see the NFL wrap itself in patriotic symbolism was both a validation of sacrifice and a reminder of what was missing. A father killed at Normandy was invoked in spirit, but his actual story, his laughter, struggles, his humanity was nowhere to be found. Football's spectacle could not carry the weight of private grief. Communities, too, bore this dual burden. In places like Green Bay, Pittsburgh, and Chicago, fans rallied behind their teams as symbols of pride. Yet those same cities held cemeteries with rows of headstones, each marking a son who had once worn a high school jersey or dreamed of playing in the league. The contrast was sharp. The stadium alive with cheers, the home quiet with absence. This tension defined the 1950s and 1960s NFL myth-making. The league promoted an image of itself as America's ultimate game, rooted in sacrifice and toughness, but in doing so, it smoothed over the jagged edges of real loss. It chose to emphasize victory rather than vulnerability. That choice resonated with a nation eager for optimism, yet it left families carrying grief largely alone. The irony was striking. The NFL built its identity on warriors, yet it had little space for mourning them. The league celebrated the idea of fallen heroes, but it rarely confronted the emptiness they left behind. Even as coaches invoked war metaphors, even as commentators praised players' battlefield toughness, the actual battlefield dead were remembered only in passing. Television magnified this effect. Families could now watch games coast to coast, the screen filled with images of young men charging into contact. It was stirring, electrifying, and deeply American. But for the widow of an NFL player lost at Okinawa, or the brother of a lineman killed in the Ardennes, those images might trigger a quieter thought, that her loved one's story had been folded into a spectacle too large and too polished to capture what had really been lost. Some players carried this unease too. Veterans who returned often remarked on the disconnect. The stadiums were full, the paychecks steadier, the league rising. But the sense of who wasn't there never fully faded. Teammates remembered fallen comrades in locker room conversations, sometimes before games, sometimes in silence. But publicly, the narrative remained clean. The NFL as a symbol of national endurance. The myth served its purpose. It helped football grow into a cultural giant. It reassured fans that the sacrifices of the war had meaning beyond the battlefield. It gave the league a mantle of seriousness, a claim to patriotism that no other sport could match. But it also obscured the complexity of grief, the fact that for families and communities, loss was not a slogan, but a lifelong wait. Consider a mother in Ohio whose son had been a promising lineman before enlisting. She watched other young men take the field on Sundays, their names celebrated in headlines. while her son's name was remembered only on a plaque outside the county courthouse. Or the young widow in Philadelphia, who raised children on her own while the NFL celebrated its growth with television contracts and championship parades. For them, the myth felt hollow. Football might honor the fallen, but it did not return what had been taken. And yet, families often still loved the game. They attended matches, cheered for teams, and took pride in the association between football and service. Their grief was not turned into bitterness, was folded into the same patriotism the league promoted. But underneath the cheers, the silence of absence never truly disappeared. This is what made the NFL's post-war story so layered, so paradoxical. The league grew by harnessing wartime sacrifice into myth, by presenting itself as the natural continuation of battlefield heroism. But in doing so, it transformed the individual stories of grief into collective symbols, stripping them of their messiness and depth. The result was a powerful narrative, but one built on selective memory. By the 1960s, as Cold War tensions rose and Vietnam loomed, the NFL's patriotic branding grew even louder. The league had perfected the language of sacrifice, toughness, and national pride. But the quieter stories, the families who never healed, the veterans who never found their place, again remained in the margins. Their truths did not vanish, but they were not the truths the league chose to highlight. And so the NFL entered the modern era carrying both triumph and omission. It had become America's game, a cultural giant, a symbol of unity. But beneath the spectacle lay unresolved grief, carried by families, communities, and veterans themselves. The myth was powerful, but the silence was heavier. The story of the NFL is not merely one of games won and lost. It is a story of power wielded by owners, coaches, players, and institutions, each seeking advantage within a system that rewards ingenuity as much as strength. From hidden salary maneuvers to deceptive play calling, from pain-masking injections to sophisticated performance analytics, the league has been shaped as much by manipulation as by athletic brilliance. To look honestly at football is to see not only triumph but compromise, not only spectacle but sacrifice. For decades, fans have celebrated the visible, the touchdowns, the dynasties, the iconic moments etched into cultural memory. Yet the hidden forces, the schemes behind closed doors, the economic pressures, the tactical manipulations have always guided what unfolded on the field. Every championship carries beneath it a lattice of decisions made at the edge of fairness. Every dynasty forged not only by talent, but by the willingness to exploit loopholes, stretch rules, and test boundaries. The NFL's history is inseparable from this relentless pursuit of advantage. Owners, wielding financial and political clout, often stood as the architects of the league's direction. Their priorities: profits, stadium deals, television contracts shaped not just business, but the rhythm of the sport itself. Expansion franchises, relocated teams, and collective bargaining battles reflected less the purity of competition than the mechanics of capital. To the casual fan, Sunday football appeared as a simple game. To those inside the league, it was a high-stakes negotiation where every decision, from player salaries to broadcast rights, represented both opportunity and risk. Manipulation was not aberration, it was expectation. Coaches, too, left legacies that straddled brilliance and controversy. Bill Belichick's Patriots dynasty, for instance, cannot be discussed without invoking Spygate and Deflategate scandals that highlighted the razor-thin line between innovation and illegality. Earlier figures, from Paul Brown's revolutionary systematization to Al Davis's rebellious defiance of authority, embodied the same tension. Greatness in football coaching often meant seeing not just the field, but the rules themselves as resources to be bent, stretched, or redefined. Strategy was rarely just about execution, it was about perception, psychology, and manipulation. Players lived at the sharpest edge of this system. Their bodies became sites of both glory and exploitation. The league celebrated them as heroes, yet often treated them as disposable assets, encouraged to play through pain, pressured to recover quickly, plead, and punished for failures that reflected systemic pressures as much as personal choices. Enhancements, legal or otherwise, were framed as moral failings when exposed, even as the league's culture implicitly demanded their use. In this way, players bore the ethical burden of a system that simultaneously glorified and commodified them. Fans, meanwhile, became both witnesses and participants. Their expectations for speed, violence, and drama fueled the demand for increasingly extreme performance. Their loyalty funded the league's expansion into a global entertainment empire. Yet most fans saw only fragments, the highlights, the controversies, the narratives crafted by networks. The deeper realities, the injections, the negotiations, the subtle manipulations of rules and perception remained largely invisible. To love football was often unknowingly to accept this duality, the beauty of the game inseparable from the compromises that sustained it. The ethical reckoning of the NFL, then, is not confined to a single scandal or era. It is cumulative, the product of decades of ambition colliding with morality. Consider the concussion crisis. For years, the league denied or minimized the long-term effects of repeated head trauma, even as mounting evidence revealed devastating consequences for former players. This was not an accident. It was an institutional strategy designed to protect the league's image and profits. Only after public pressure, lawsuits, and relentless advocacy did the NFL acknowledge what insiders already knew: that the pursuit of spectacle carried a profound human cost. The concussion crisis exemplifies a larger truth. Every manipulation, whether financial, tactical, or medical, carries hidden consequences. Salary cap tricks may destabilize franchises in the long run. Playbook deception may erode the spirit of fair play. Pain-masking drugs may deliver short-term victories at the expense of long-term health. The league thrives in the short term, but its legacy is shadowed by the cumulative toll of these compromises. The NFL, in many ways, is both a monument to human ingenuity and a cautionary tale about unchecked ambition. And yet, this complexity is precisely why the NFL endures. It reflects not just the game, but the society around it. America itself is a nation built on innovation, ambition, and competition, but also on compromise, manipulation, and ethical gray zones. Football is its perfect mirror, a sport that celebrates teamwork and sacrifice while concealing the costs borne by individuals. A spectacle that inspires unity on Sundays while embodying the contradictions of a profit-driven system. The NFL's power lies in this duality, is both an escape and a revelation, both entertainment and ethical debate. The question, then, is not whether manipulation exists in the NFL. It always has, and always will. The question is how it should be understood, regulated, or redefined. Should rules evolve to close loopholes more aggressively, or is manipulation itself an inevitable expression of competitive brilliance? Should player welfare be prioritized above all else, even if it changes the nature of the spectacle? Should fans demand transparency or accept the game as a carefully managed illusion? These are not simple questions, and their answers shift with each generation. Looking forward, the future of the NFL will be shaped by how it balances these tensions. Technology promises new forms of advantage and new temptations for manipulation. Biometric tracking may optimize performance, but also invade privacy. Artificial intelligence may revolutionize scouting and play calling, but could widen the gap between teams with resources and those without. Medical advances may prolong careers while simultaneously creating pressure to push human limits even further. Each innovation carries the shadow of ethical compromise, and the league's willingness to confront or conceal these dilemmas will define its legacy. Ultimately, the NFL's hidden history of manipulation is not a condemnation, but a recognition. The league has never been pure, but neither has any great human endeavor. Its brilliance lies in its capacity to evolve, to absorb scandal, to reinvent itself while retaining its magnetic hold on millions. To understand football is to see both its glory and its shadows, to recognize that every touchdown carries with it unseen costs. Every dynasty built not only on talent but on calculation. Every legend shaped as much by compromise as by courage. The legacy of the NFL, then, is not simply one of sport. It is a parable of power, ambition, and ethics. It is the story of how far humans will go to win, to profit, to endure. It is a reminder that every system of greatness is also a system of compromise. And it is an invitation not to reject the game, but to see it fully, with eyes open to both the spectacle and the shadows. In the end, football is a mirror. What it reflects depends on where you look. You may see athleticism, strategy, and triumph. Or you may see manipulation, sacrifice, and ethical ambiguity. Both are true. Both define the game. And in that complexity lies the enduring fascination of the NFL. A sport that is never just a sport, but a stage on which the deepest struggles of human ambition, morality, and legacy play out every week, beneath the roar of the crowd and the glare of the lights. The story of the NFL's early years, the pain, the sacrifice, the brutality, was never just about football. It was about survival. It was about a league that walked a tightrope between collapse and resilience, between obscurity and cultural power. And like the nation that birthed it, the NFL emerged from its darkest chapters, scarred, altered, but unbroken. When we look back now, through the haze of memory and mythology, we tend to see football's rise as inevitably sways, though it were destined to become America's favorite spectacle. But that's an illusion of hindsight. In truth, the NFL's survival was fragile at every step. The brutal 1920s tested whether the game could even hold together. When its players had little more than leather helmets and desperation to shield them. The Great Depression tested whether anyone would pay to watch a game when bread lines stretched around city blocks. And the war years tested whether the league could survive at all, stripped of its stars, shadowed by silence. Playing games in the middle of the greatest conflict the world had ever seen. Each of those trials left its mark. They forged the NFL into something colder, harder, more resilient. They gave the league its DNA, not just entertainment, but endurance. The NFL learned that survival meant adaptation, ruthlessness, and sacrifice. And it learned that behind every highlight reel, every touchdown, every championship, there were shadows. Bodies broken, dreams deferred, voices silenced. That's the dark side of the league's legacy. For every celebrated hero, there were men who paid a price the public never saw. Some bore scars across their faces and torsos. Some carried wounds invisible, memories they never spoke aloud. Some never returned to the field at all, lost to poverty, to injury, to war. And yet their absence, those empty spaces in team photos. Those names scratched from rosters helped shape the very foundation of the league we celebrate today. It's tempting to glorify those men as martyrs for the game, to wrap their stories in nostalgia and grit. But to do that is to miss the truth. They weren't symbols, they were human beings. Fathers, brothers, sons. Men whose only crime was loving a game that demanded more from them than it ever gave back. Still, they played. Because in those years, football wasn't just a sport. It was a chance. A chance to belong, to earn, to endure. For some, it was a way out of the mines, the factories, the street corners. For others, it was a way to channel rage, hunger, or pride. The NFL's rise was never clean. It was carved from struggle. Every roar of the crowd was built on a foundation of sacrifice. And the league knew it. That's why, after the war, it leaned into growth with almost manic determination. Television contracts, expansion franchises, new rules, all of it was an attempt to transform football into something bigger, brighter, untouchable. But beneath the polish of spectacle, the shadows remained. Even today, those shadows are visible if you know where to look. In the debates about player safety, in the silent suffering of retirees whose bodies gave out long before their time, in the way the league markets toughness, while rarely acknowledging the quiet toll it exacts. The NFL's roots remind us that what we see on Sundays, the glamour, the wealth, the spectacle, was born from decades of men who endured something closer to survival than sport. And yet, perhaps that is what makes the league's story so deeply American. This country has always celebrated triumph while burying the cost. We raise statues to victories, but rarely to scars. We celebrate the resilience without asking too many questions about what it demanded. Football reflects that instinct with uncanny precision. It gives us heroes to admire, villains to despise, dynasties to remember. But behind the curtain, it carries silences too heavy for highlight reels. Still, the story of the NFL's Darkside is not one of despair. It's one of endurance. It's about how men who should have been broken by circumstance refused to quit. How a league that should have folded in the 1930s held on long enough to find its place in America's soul. And how, in the crucible of depression and war, the game discovered its true identity, not as a diversion, not as an afterthought, but as a mirror of the nation itself. That mirror shows us something uncomfortable. It reminds us that greatness is never free, that for every champion we remember, there are countless others we forget. That the history of football isn't only written in trophies, but in the unseen sacrifices that made those trophies possible. And maybe that's why the NFL endures. Because in its shadows, in its dark side, it carries the same contradictions we all carry. Pride and pain, triumph and tragedy, glory and silence. The league doesn't just tell the story of a sport, it tells the story of a country that learned to keep marching forward, no matter the cost. As we close this journey through the league's darkest decades, it's worth asking ourselves, what does it mean to celebrate football? Do we cheer only for the spectacle, or do we acknowledge the sacrifices beneath it? Do we see only the heroes, or do we remember the silences? The answer lies in whether we're willing to look beyond the surface, to honor not just the victories, but the cost of those victories. Because the NFL's dark side isn't a relic of history. It's still here, echoing in the collisions on the field, in the debates over safety and health, in the quiet testimonies of men who gave more than the game ever gave back. The shadows stretch from the leather helmet days to the billion-dollar stadiums of today. And if we ignore them, we risk losing sight of what football really is. It is beautiful. It is brutal. It is America at its most inspiring and at its most unforgiving. The NFL has always been both. And that, more than anything, is its true legacy. So when the lights go down and the roar fades, when the final whistle blows and the crowd drifts into the night, we're left with the echoes. The echoes of men who played through pain, through hunger, through war. The echoes of survival. The echoes of silence. And maybe, if we listen closely enough, those echoes tell us the truth. That football, for all its spectacle, is really a story about what it takes to endure. And that's the dark side of the NFL. Not a tale of unbroken glory, but a story of sacrifice, of silence, and of survival. A story worth remembering.